It was a calm, ordinary Wednesday morning in Oklahoma City. The sun rose over the downtown skyline, casting golden light across office buildings, parking lots, and the streets filled with workers, parents, and children beginning their day. Among them was the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, an unassuming 9-story structure that housed various federal agencies: Social Security, the Secret Service, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms ATF. On any other day, it was simply a place where hundreds of Americans worked to serve their community. But on this day, April 19, 1995, the heart of Oklahoma City would be forever changed. At exactly 9:02 a.m., a massive explosion ripped through downtown. The force of the blast shattered glass up to 50 blocks away, the air filled with dust, fire, and screams. Within seconds, a third of the Murrah building collapsed, leaving a crater more than 30 feet wide and 8 feet deep. Cars burst into flames, nearby buildings crumbled, and chaos overtook the streets. People stumbled out of offices, bloodied and dazed, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Across the city, emergency calls flooded dispatch centers. Police, firefighters, and paramedics raced toward the scene, expecting perhaps a gas explosion or an accident. What they found was devastation, unlike anything they had ever faced. Entire floors of the building were pancaked into rubble. Children from the America's Kids Daycare Center, located on the second floor, were buried beneath debris. Rescue workers began to dig frantically, using bare hands, broken boards, anything they could find. Reporters soon arrived, broadcasting live images across the nation. Americans watching on television saw a nightmare unfold in real time, smoke rising from the ruins, rescuers carrying wounded children, office workers weeping in shock. President Bill Clinton, upon receiving the news, was briefed that a large bomb had detonated outside a federal building. The word terrorism surfaced almost immediately. In the hours that followed, authorities began to piece together what had happened. Witnesses reported seeing a large yellow Ryder rental truck parked in front of the building shortly before the blast. Investigators soon determined that the explosion had been caused by a powerful truck bomb, an improvised device made from ammonium nitrate fertilizer, diesel fuel, and other chemicals. It was designed to inflict maximum destruction, and it had done exactly that. As emergency workers continued their rescue operations, the human toll became tragically clear. 168 people were dead, including 19 children, and more than 680 others injured. The bombing instantly became the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in U.S. history up to that point. Yet behind this unimaginable loss lay a plan carried out not by foreign extremists, but by 2 American citizens, men motivated by hatred toward their own government. While rescuers worked through the day and into the night, investigators from the FBI and ATF began following a crucial lead: a vehicle identification number, VIAND, found on a piece of the Ryder truck's axle. That small fragment would lead them to a rental shop in Junction City, Kansas, where the truck had been rented by a man using the fake name Robert D. Kling. The description given by the rental agent matched one person exactly: Timothy McVeigh, a former U.S. Army soldier. What no one yet realized was that McVeigh had already been arrested just 90 minutes after the explosion, stopped by an Oklahoma State trooper for driving without a license plate. At the time, he was carrying a concealed handgun, which led to his detention in a small county jail, completely separate from the chaos unfolding in Oklahoma City. Within days, the link would be made, and the full scope of his actions would begin to emerge. As night fell over Oklahoma City, floodlights illuminated the rubble. Families gathered behind police lines, waiting desperately for news of loved ones. Rescue dogs searched tirelessly, and volunteers brought food, water, and blankets to first responders. Amid the smoke and ruin, the nation mourned together. The Oklahoma City bombing was not just an attack on a building. It was an attack on the very sense of security Americans held in their homeland. The day ended in sorrow, confusion, and disbelief. But for investigators, it marked only the beginning of a long and painful journey toward justice. The pieces of a chilling plot were scattered across multiple states, and in the coming chapters, the truth behind Timothy McVeigh's deadly mission would be revealed in full. Before the smoke cleared in Oklahoma City, before the world even knew his name, Timothy James McVeigh had already set his plan in motion and watched its aftermath unfold from a distance to understand why a young, decorated American veteran became the mastermind behind the deadliest domestic terrorist act in U.S. history. One must go back to his beginnings, to the quiet town of Pendleton, New York, where he was born on April 23, 1968. McVeigh grew up in a modest, working-class family. His parents divorced when he was a teenager, leaving him withdrawn and often alone. He was described by classmates as intelligent but socially distant, a boy fascinated by guns, survivalism, and the military. He read war novels, practiced shooting, and spent hours immersed in stories about soldiers and freedom fighters. As he grew older, his admiration for the military and his distrust of government authority deepened side by side. In 1988, at age 20, McVeigh enlisted in the U.S. Army. He excelled in training and was eventually deployed to Saudi Arabia during the Gulf War in 1991. By all accounts, he performed well, earning medals and commendations for his marksmanship and discipline. But something inside him began to shift. The war and the government's role in it left him disillusioned. He returned from combat feeling betrayed, believing that the government he had fought for was becoming the very tyrant it claimed to oppose. After leaving the army, McVeigh drifted through a series of odd jobs. He spent long hours reading anti-government literature, especially the controversial novel, The Turner Diaries, which depicted a violent uprising against a totalitarian government and the bombing of a federal building. The book's themes of resistance, racial hatred, and militia warfare deeply influenced him. McVeigh began to see himself as a soldier in a coming revolution, a patriot fighting against government oppression. The Waco siege of 1993 became a turning point. Watching the live broadcast of federal agents clashing with the Branch Davidians in Texas, McVeigh was enraged by what he saw as government tyranny. The siege ended with a massive fire that killed 76 people, including children, For McVeigh, this was the final confirmation that the U.S. government had become an enemy of its people. He vowed to strike back. In 1994, McVeigh reconnected with an old Army friend, Terry Nichols, who shared some of his anti-government beliefs. Together, they began experimenting with explosives. They gathered materials, studied bomb-making manuals, and tested small detonations on rural land. McVeigh's plan became clearer. He would attack a federal building to send a message, to punish the government for Waco and Ruby Ridge, and to inspire a new uprising. He chose Oklahoma City for its symbolic and practical reasons. The Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building represented federal authority, but had limited security. It housed agencies that McVeigh associated with government overreach, particularly the ATF. It was also accessible and had a parking area that allowed a large truck to be parked close to the structure. The location was perfect for maximum impact. Over several months, McVeigh and Nichols gathered the ingredients for their bomb: ammonium nitrate fertilizer, nitromethane, diesel fuel, and other chemicals, common materials that, when combined, created a devastating explosive. They purchased these supplies in small quantities from different stores to avoid suspicion. McVeigh meticulously calculated the proportions and timing mechanism, treating the construction of the bomb with the precision of a military operation. By April 1995, the plan was complete. McVeigh rented a 20-foot Ryder truck in Junction City, Kansas, using a fake name, Robert D. Kling, and paid in cash. He spent days preparing the bomb, loading barrels of explosive mixture into the truck and wiring the fuses. On the evening of April 18, he drove to Oklahoma City and parked a short distance away to rest. He spent the night in his car, quietly reviewing every step of his plan. He was calm, composed, and resolute. At dawn, McVeigh dressed neatly in jeans and a T-shirt bearing the image of Abraham Lincoln and the Latin phrase, Sic semper tyrannis, thus always to tyrants. It was the same phrase shouted by John Wilkes Booth after assassinating Lincoln. McVeigh considered himself a modern revolutionary, not a murderer. As he drove the Ryder truck toward the Murrah building that morning, he kept his eyes fixed ahead. Traffic was light. Workers were just arriving, children being dropped off at daycare. He parked the truck directly beneath the daycare windows, lit the fuse, and walked away. He didn't look back. Minutes later, at 9:02 a.m., the explosion ripped through downtown. The blast killed 168 people, injured hundreds more, and destroyed or damaged more than 300 buildings. McVeigh had achieved what he believed was revenge for Waco, but in truth, he had unleashed one of the darkest moments in American history. As he drove away from the city, he felt no remorse. In his mind, this was justice. He believed Americans would rise up against their government, inspired by his act. But instead, his actions united the nation, not in rebellion, but in grief and outrage. By the end of that day, McVeigh was already in handcuffs, stopped by chance for a missing license plate. He sat silently in jail, unaware that investigators were already closing in on him, piecing together the trail that would expose him as the Oklahoma City bomber. The man who saw himself as a patriot had become, in the eyes of the world, a terrorist, and his arrest would set off one of the largest federal investigations in U.S. history. In the hours after the explosion, the streets of downtown Oklahoma City resembled a war zone. Rescue teams swarmed the wreckage, firefighters worked through choking smoke, and civilians formed human chains to carry the wounded to safety. Amid the chaos, law enforcement agencies across the nation mobilized. The FBI, ATF, Secret Service, and local police knew immediately that this was not an accident. It was a deliberate, coordinated act of terrorism. Inside the smoldering remains of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, investigators began searching for physical evidence that could explain what had happened. The magnitude of destruction was immense, but forensic teams knew that even the smallest fragment could hold the key to identifying the perpetrator. Within hours, bomb technicians determined that the explosion originated from a vehicle bomb parked just outside the building's north face. Sifting through twisted metal and concrete, investigators discovered a crucial piece of evidence: a rear axle from a truck, blasted clear of the explosion's epicenter, but still bearing a vehicle identification number, VN. That number, painstakingly recovered and traced, became the cornerstone of the investigation. It led them to a rider rental agency in Junction City, Kansas, where a man had rented a truck under the name Robert D. Kling. The rental employee, a man named Eldon Elliott, vividly remembered the customer. He was tall, lean, clean-cut, and seemed polite. He wore a baseball cap and presented a phony ID card. The description he gave matched a composite sketch that would soon become famous nationwide: a young white male in his 20s with short military-style hair. The FBI immediately distributed the sketch, codenamed John Doe 1, across all law enforcement networks. The search was officially on. Meanwhile, forensic teams continued to analyze debris from the bombing site. Residue samples confirmed that the explosive compound was made primarily of ammonium nitrate fertilizer and fuel oil, the same combination used in agricultural and mining operations. It was powerful, accessible, and devastatingly effective. Investigators now knew the bomb had been homemade, and that the materials could be traced to specific purchases. Back in Kansas, local witnesses came forward. They reported seeing a rider truck, matching the description, parked outside a cheap motel, where a man resembling the suspect had stayed just days before the bombing. One clerk remembered him checking in under the same alias, Robert D. Kling. From that point, the FBI began retracing every step, every receipt, every face connected to that truck. Then came a stunning break in the case. An FBI analyst cross-referenced the rental paperwork with motor vehicle records and realized that the name, Kling, and the description matched a man who had once served in the U.S. Army, Timothy McVeigh. His name triggered immediate recognition among federal agents, as McVeigh had been detained in a small jail in Perry, Oklahoma, just 90 minutes after the bombing. The arresting officer, Trooper Charlie Hanger, had pulled him over for driving a yellow 1977 Mercury Marquis with no license plate. McVeigh had been carrying a loaded Glock pistol and several rounds of ammunition. Because of the firearm, he was held in custody awaiting a court appearance for weapons charges. When FBI agents realized that the man they were hunting, the suspect in the worst terrorist attack in American history, was already in custody, the news spread like wildfire through command centers. Within hours, McVeigh was formally identified and transferred to federal custody. The timing had been almost miraculous. Had Trooper Hanger not stopped him, McVeigh might have vanished entirely. The evidence began stacking up quickly. Fingerprints and witness statements placed McVeigh at key locations leading up to the bombing. Receipts for ammonium nitrate purchases were traced to a farm supply store in Kansas. Motel records, rental agreements, and sightings all converged on the same name. Even the T-shirt McVeigh wore at the time of his arrest. A shirt emblazoned with the quote, "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants," revealed his anti-government ideology. The FBI investigators soon turned their attention to possible accomplices. Records and phone calls linked McVeigh to Terry Nichols, a fellow Army veteran and close friend who had helped him acquire bomb materials. Agents raided Nichols' home in Harrington, Kansas, where they uncovered explosive residues, receipts, and documents referencing the fertilizer and chemicals used in the bomb. Nichols surrendered voluntarily, but denied being involved in the actual detonation. He admitted, however, that McVeigh had talked about striking the government to make them pay. As news of McVeigh's arrest broke, the nation reacted with a mix of shock, anger, and disbelief. Many Americans found it difficult to comprehend that the bombing had been carried out not by foreign enemies, but by one of their own, a white, middle-class Army veteran who claimed to love his country. The notion of domestic terrorism suddenly took on a new and horrifying meaning. In Oklahoma City, rescue operations continued around the clock. The death toll climbed as bodies were recovered from the wreckage, including infants from the daycare center. Families waited outside in agony, clinging to hope that their loved ones might still be alive. President Clinton declared a national day of mourning, promising justice for the victims. "We will find the people who did this," he vowed. "Justice will be swift, certain, and severe." For investigators, justice began with evidence. The case against McVeigh grew stronger by the hour. Chemical traces matching the bomb materials were found on his clothing, and witnesses confirmed his presence near the rental truck days before the explosion. When confronted with the evidence, McVeigh remained calm, emotionless, and unapologetic. He insisted that he was fighting against what he called a corrupt government, and claimed his actions were necessary. But the world saw something very different. A man who had slaughtered 168 innocent people, including children as young as 3 months old. McVeigh's capture marked the end of the manhunt, but the beginning of a historic legal battle. The American justice system now faced the monumental task of prosecuting a crime that had shaken the nation's very soul. When Timothy McVeigh was captured, much of America assumed he had acted alone, a lone extremist who turned his rage into violence. But as the FBI dug deeper, it became clear that this bombing was not a random act of madness. It was the result of years of radicalization, careful planning, and the influence of a broader anti-government movement that had been simmering across the United States throughout the early 1990s. To understand McVeigh's crime, investigators had to understand the world that shaped him and the people who helped make it possible. Following the end of the Gulf War, McVeigh found himself adrift. The army had been his purpose, his identity. But when he failed to qualify for the elite special forces and left military service, he became disillusioned. He no longer trusted the government he once swore to defend. He began to drift into a shadowy world of militia groups, survivalists, and anti-federal activists, many of whom believed that the U.S. government was plotting to disarm citizens and impose tyranny. He traveled from gun shows to militia meetings across the Midwest, selling survival gear, military manuals, and copies of the Turner Diaries, a novel that became a Bible for extremist movements. McVeigh was quiet but intense, often engaging strangers in conversations about government overreach, gun control, and the Second Amendment. His obsession grew after two major events that radicalized many Americans on the far right, and Wacoca's 1993. At Ruby Ridge, federal agents had killed a woman and child during a standoff with a survivalist family in Idaho. At Waco, a botched raid by the ATF and FBI on a religious sect led to a fiery siege that killed 76 Branch Davidians, including women and children. To McVeigh, these were not isolated tragedies. They were evidence of a federal war against its own citizens. He saw himself as a soldier standing against oppression. Around this time, McVeigh renewed contact with his old army buddy, Terry Nichols, a quiet man from Michigan who shared many of his views. Nichols was older and less volatile, but deeply distrustful of the government. The two spent long nights discussing gun rights, the Constitution, and their shared hatred of federal authority. Nichols' brother, James Nichols, was also sympathetic, stockpiling weapons and explosives at his Michigan farm. Together, McVeigh and Terry Nichols began to form what they believed was a mission, an act of retaliation for Waco and a warning to the government. Their correspondence and notes showed that they viewed April 19, 1995, the second anniversary of the Waco siege's fiery end, as a symbolic day of vengeance. The date was chosen deliberately. Over the course of several months, they began gathering materials for what would become one of the largest homemade bombs in history. They purchased fertilizer, grade ammonium nitrate, fuel oil, nitromethane, and other chemicals. To disguise their intentions, they bought supplies from different stores across Kansas and Arizona, paying cash whenever possible. They stored the materials in storage units and rural fields, far from prying eyes. McVeigh's technical precision was chilling. He meticulously studied the chemical compositions, testing small-scale explosives to perfect the mixture. Using his military experience, he planned every step with cold efficiency, from the blast radius to the parking position of the truck. Nichols assisted him in acquiring supplies and mixing chemicals, though later he would claim he thought McClaim was bluffing about actually detonating a bomb. By early April 1995, The operation was in its final phase. McVeigh purchased a Ryder truck from Junction City, Kansas, using a fake ID that listed his name as Robert D. Kling, claiming to be a military contractor moving supplies. Over the next few days, he and Nichols loaded the truck with barrels filled with the explosive mixture, wiring them with blasting caps and timing devices. Each barrel contained enough power to destroy a building floor. Together, they would create an inferno. McVeigh's attention to symbolism went beyond the date. He believed he was striking a blow for liberty, positioning himself as a modern-day revolutionary. He even made photocopies of the Declaration of Independence to hand out in the days leading up to the bombing, portraying his attack as an act of resistance rather than terror. In the days before the explosion, McVeigh separated from Nichols, telling him to go back to his family. He didn't want anyone else near Oklahoma City when the bomb went off. On April 16, 1995, 3 days before the attack, he drove to Oklahoma, sleeping in his car and finalizing his route. He visited the Murrah Federal Building several times, observing traffic patterns and identifying the perfect location for the truck. On April 18, McVeigh checked into the Dreamland Motel under a false name. He spent the evening cleaning his gun, assembling his detonators, and preparing his escape plan. At dawn, he filled the truck's tank, drove downtown, and parked directly outside the Murrah building. The bomb's timer was set to detonate at 9:02 a.m. What followed was destruction on a scale no one could have imagined. When the bomb exploded, McVeigh's truck vanished in an instant, replaced by a crater of death and debris. The Murrah building's facade disintegrated, and 168 lives were extinguished in seconds. As McVeigh drove north toward Kansas, he felt a strange calm. He later claimed that as he looked in his rearview mirror, he saw the plume of smoke rising from the city and felt relief, believing he had accomplished his mission. To him, the victims were collateral damage in a war he had declared against what he saw as an unjust government. The FBI would later call it the perfect crime, undone by a missing license plate. McVeigh's arrest, just hours after the bombing, revealed how a small town soldier had evolved into a symbol of American extremism. He wasn't part of a global terrorist network. He wasn't trained by foreign enemies. He was an American citizen, shaped by anger, isolation, and an ideology that twisted patriotism into destruction. The Oklahoma City bombing became a national reckoning, a harsh reminder that terrorism can come from within, born not of foreign hatred, but of domestic despair and fury. And as the investigation deepened, the story of how McVeigh was brought to justice would reveal not only his guilt, but the unsettling truth about the growing undercurrents of homegrown extremism in America. When Timothy McVeigh was officially transferred into federal custody, the mood among investigators was a mix of relief and grim determination. The man they now faced was not frantic or defiant, but calm, almost unnervingly so. Sitting across from the FBI agents in an interrogation room in Perry, Oklahoma, McVeigh appeared more like an ordinary young veteran than the architect of one of the most devastating attacks in American history. His demeanor was polite, composed, and detached. But beneath that calm surface lay an unshakable conviction that what he had done was justified. The first thing that struck investigators was his lack of emotion. When asked about the bombing and the 168 lives lost, McVeigh neither expressed regret nor attempted to deny his role. He spoke with calculated precision, offering minimal details, choosing his words carefully. To him, this was not murder. It was war. He described himself not as a terrorist, but as a freedom fighter, striking back against what he saw as government tyranny. FBI Special Agent Danny Deffenbaugh and other lead investigators pressed him for specifics. How he built the bomb, who helped him, and why he chose the Murrah building. McVeigh refused to cooperate on many points, invoking his right to silence. However, he did not hide his ideology. He made it clear that the bombing was revenge for Waco and a warning to the federal government that the people will not tolerate oppression. He saw the federal raid on the Branch Davidians as murder, and he believed his attack was a proportional response. As agents questioned him about his time in the Army, McVeigh reflected fondly on his service. He talked about discipline, loyalty, and pride in his country. The contradiction was glaring. How could a man who once wore the American flag on his shoulder now justify bombing fellow Americans? For McVeigh, the answer lay in his warped sense of patriotism. He believed that the United States had strayed from its founding principles, that the government had become tyrannical, and that violent rebellion was not only justified but necessary. During the interrogation, McVeigh occasionally quoted from the Turner Diaries, a novel that had deeply influenced him. In one chilling moment, he reportedly referred to the bombing as necessary evil, echoing the book's narrative of a white nationalist revolution against the government. He saw himself as a catalyst, expecting that his act would inspire others to rise up in arms. When that didn't happen, he was disappointed but not remorseful. Meanwhile, agents were gathering overwhelming physical evidence linking him to the bombing. Chemical traces of ammonium nitrate and fuel oil were found on his clothing. Witnesses identified him as the man who rented the Ryder truck. Receipts for bomb-making materials were tied to his name and nickels. It was a seamless trail of proof. When confronted with these facts, McVeigh didn't panic. He almost seemed proud. He told one investigator, "The truth doesn't matter. The truth is what the people believe." His calmness disturbed even seasoned law enforcement officers. Here was a man who had killed 19 children, yet spoke as if he had accomplished something noble. He referred to the victims as unfortunate casualties and insisted that he had targeted the government, not civilians. When asked if he regretted the deaths of the children in the daycare center, he paused only briefly before saying, "That's the price of war." That statement alone sent chills through everyone in the room. The psychological profile that emerged painted a complex picture. McVeigh was not insane in the traditional sense. He was logical, articulate, and methodical, but he was consumed by ideology. His sense of moral clarity was absolute, leaving no room for empathy. He viewed his actions through a distorted lens of patriotism, convincing himself that he was defending liberty rather than destroying lives. As the interrogation continued, McVeigh's ties to Terry Nichols and others came into sharper focus. He admitted knowing Nichols well and working with him on projects, but downplayed Nichols' direct involvement in the bombing itself. He also mentioned visiting Elohim City, a compound known for hosting white supremacists and anti-government extremists, though he denied that anyone there helped him. Investigators suspected that McVeigh had broader connections to militia networks across the country, but conclusive evidence remained elusive. Outside the interrogation room, the public's outrage was mounting. News coverage of the bombing and McVeigh's arrest dominated every network. Americans wanted answers, and more than that, they wanted justice. The image of McVeigh being led into custody in an orange jumpsuit, expressionless and unrepentant, became seared into the national consciousness. He had become the face of homegrown terrorism. When McVeigh was informed that the government would seek the death penalty, he showed no visible reaction. In fact, he later told his attorneys that he expected it and welcomed it. He saw his potential execution as martyrdom, a way to further spread his message of resistance. He even referred to his upcoming trial as an opportunity to put the government itself on trial. But to the victims' families, there was nothing noble or political about what he had done. For them, it was murder, plain and horrific. The funerals had begun, and the grief was immeasurable. Tiny white coffins carried the youngest victims of the daycare center. Rescue workers broke down as they recalled the sound of parents screaming the names of their missing children. Oklahoma City had become a city of sorrow. McVeigh, however, showed no empathy. In his mind, emotion was weakness. He spent his days reading books about revolution and history while awaiting trial, writing letters to sympathizers who viewed him as a hero. His writings were filled with self-righteous anger, peppered with quotes from Thomas Jefferson and the Founding Fathers, men whose ideals he had distorted beyond recognition. For federal prosecutors, the task ahead was monumental. They had to build a case so strong that there would be no doubt of McVeigh's guilt, not just in the eyes of the law, but in the eyes of a grieving nation. The upcoming trial would be more than a criminal proceeding. It would be a test of American justice itself. The trial of Timothy McVeigh began in April 1997, 2 years after the Oklahoma City bombing, under extraordinary public scrutiny. Every camera, every newspaper, and every citizen with a television had their eyes fixed on the man accused of murdering 168 innocent people. The attack had left a scar not only on Oklahoma City, but on the very soul of America. Now, the country was ready to see justice served. The courtroom in Denver, Colorado, was chosen to ensure fairness, a neutral venue far from the emotional devastation in Oklahoma. Yet even in this distant city, the weight of grief and anger followed. Families of victims filled the gallery, holding photos of loved ones, wearing pins and ribbons as silent symbols of loss. Reporters filled every seat, their pens ready to document every breath, every word spoken by the man at the center of the storm. When Timothy McVeigh entered the courtroom for the first time, he appeared composed and eerily calm. Dressed neatly in a white shirt and tie, he looked nothing like the monster the public imagined. He stood tall, eyes forward, with the same stoic expression that had become his trademark. He did not avert his gaze from the judge, the jury, or the victims' families. If he felt guilt, it was invisible. The prosecution, led by U.S. Attorney Joseph Hartzler, wasted no time outlining the horrific details of April 19. With a firm voice, Hartzler declared, this was not a random act. This was cold, calculated mass murder. The prosecution painted McVeigh as a domestic terrorist who betrayed his oath as a soldier and his countrymen. They promised to show that his actions were driven not by insanity or impulse, but by ideology and vengeance. Prosecutors presented an overwhelming mountain of evidence. Witnesses testified that McVeigh had rented the Ryder truck under a false name. Employees from the Elliott's Body Shop in Junction City pointed directly to him as the man who had signed the papers for the vehicle. Chemical experts demonstrated that residue found on McVeigh's clothes matched the composition of the bomb. Receipts linked him to the purchase of fertilizer and other explosive materials. It was a seamless chain of proof, connecting him to every step of the crime. The jury also heard the haunting 911 calls from that fateful morning. The screams, the panic, the chaos. Photographs of the destroyed Murrah building were displayed on a projector. The images silenced the courtroom. Twisted steel beams, crushed concrete, and children's toys covered in dust filled the screen. Jurors wept. Even hardened reporters struggled to look. These were not just exhibits. They were human stories written in tragedy. Then came the testimony of survivors and first responders. Firefighters described the scene as hell on earth. Rescue workers recalled carrying out the lifeless bodies of infants from the daycare center. One nurse spoke softly through tears, saying, "You could feel the building breathing, shifting under your feet as we dug for anyone still alive." Their words turned the courtroom into a place of shared mourning, reminding everyone that justice was not about vengeance, but about truth. When it came time for the defense, McVeigh's attorneys, Stephen Jones and his team, faced an impossible task. They did not deny the horror of the bombing, but sought to humanize McVeigh, to explain his path from soldier to terrorist. They argued that McVeigh was shaped by government actions, Ruby Ridge, Waco, and that he had come to believe violence was the only way to make his voice heard. The defense tried to plant doubt about Terry Nichols' involvement, suggesting that McVeigh might not have acted entirely alone. But the evidence was overwhelming. McVeigh's fingerprints, his writings, his words, all pointed to guilt. The defense strategy of painting him as a misguided patriot rather than a murderer fell flat in the face of 168 graves. When McVeigh took the stand, he did not testify in his own defense. Instead, he remained silent, letting his attorneys speak for him. But his silence spoke volumes. To many, it was not the silence of humility. It was the silence of defiance. Throughout the trial, McVeigh appeared detached, even smug at times. When victims' families stared at him, he met their eyes without flinching. Some described him as emotionless. Others thought they saw the faint hint of pride. His coldness infuriated those who had lost everything. One mother of a 3-year-old victim said, "He looked at us like we didn't matter, like our children were just numbers to him." After 6 weeks of testimony, the case was handed to the jury. It took them only 23 hours to reach a verdict. On June 2, 1997, they returned to the courtroom. The nation held its breath as the judge read the words, "We, the jury, find the defendant, Timothy James McVeigh, guilty on all counts." Gasps filled the room. Some victims' families wept quietly, others embraced in relief. Outside the courthouse, the news spread instantly. Across the country, Americans who had followed the case for 2 years finally exhaled. Justice, at least in part, had been served, but the trial was not over. The next phase would determine McVeigh's punishment, life imprisonment, or death. During sentencing, prosecutors presented heart-wrenching testimony from families who had lost loved ones. Parents spoke of empty bedrooms, birthdays that would never be celebrated, and the sound of laughter that would never return. The weight of their pain filled every corner of the courtroom. When given the chance to speak, McVeigh declined to express remorse. Instead, he quoted a line from William Ernest Henley's poem, Invictus. "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." His choice of words confirmed what many already believed. He saw himself not as a criminal, but as a martyr. On June 13, 1997, the jury delivered its final decision, death by lethal injection. The courtroom fell silent. McVeigh showed no reaction. He simply nodded once, as if acknowledging the inevitable. For the victims' families, the sentence brought closure, but not healing. Justice had been delivered, but the wounds of April 19 would never truly fade. Outside the courthouse, Attorney General Janet Reno addressed the nation. The verdict of the jury speaks for the rule of law in this country. Timothy McVeigh sought to destroy our government, but he only strengthened our resolve. The Oklahoma City bombing trial was more than a legal proceeding. It was a moral reckoning. It reaffirmed that no ideology, no anger, and no twisted vision of patriotism could ever justify the murder of innocent lives. As McVeigh awaited execution on death row, he continued to show no remorse. His letters from prison revealed the same defiance, the same cold logic that had driven him to commit mass murder. But for the families of the victims, his fate was no longer in his hands. It was in the hands of the justice system he had tried to destroy. After his conviction and death sentence in 1997, Timothy McVeigh was transferred to U.S. Penitentiary Terre Haute in Indiana, the federal facility designated for death row inmates. There, behind the cold steel doors of a maximum security cell, began the final chapter of his life, a life that had already left 168 others shattered in ashes and sorrow. His cell measured less than 8 feet by 10, containing a metal bed, a small sink, a toilet, and a narrow slit of a window that let in little sunlight. The isolation was absolute. McVeigh was allowed minimal contact with other prisoners, and spent almost 23 hours a day alone. Yet even in confinement, he projected calm, confidence, and, disturbingly, pride. To prison officials and reporters, McVeigh appeared detached from his impending execution. He spent his time reading, writing letters, and corresponding with sympathizers who saw him as a soldier against tyranny. He refused to see himself as a terrorist. To him, he was still a patriot, a man who had taken action against what he believed was government overreach, his own version of justice. He read philosophy, military strategy, and writings about rebellion. Books like the Turner Diaries remained central to his warped worldview. In his letters, McVeigh showed no remorse for the bombing. Instead, he wrote about the event as though it were a calculated act of war. He once described the victims as collateral damage in a larger struggle. These words, cold and unfeeling, were reprinted in newspapers across the country, reigniting anger among survivors and families. Journalists who managed to interview McVeigh were struck by his composure. In one televised interview, he sat calmly, answering questions in a flat, emotionless tone. When asked if he regretted his actions, he replied, "Regret means you think you did something wrong. I don't." His lack of empathy horrified viewers. It was as if the suffering of hundreds of families meant nothing to him. For the survivors of the bombing, McVeigh's attitude was a second wound, a reopening of pain that had barely begun to heal. Many had hoped that isolation and time would bring reflection, maybe even remorse. But McVeigh's conviction in his cause only hardened. He saw himself not as a murderer, but as a warning. The government should be afraid of its people. He once wrote, echoing his distorted version of revolutionary ideals. His correspondence became a subject of study among criminologists and psychologists, trying to understand how a man who once served in the U.S. Army could transform into a domestic terrorist. Some labeled him a sociopath, intelligent, methodical, and entirely devoid of empathy. Others saw him as a product of extremist ideology, radicalized by paranoia and rage against authority, but no label could undo what he had done. Meanwhile, the victims' families struggled with the long wait for justice. Federal appeals, automatic in death penalty cases, dragged on for years. Each hearing forced them to relive the horror, to see McVeigh's name in headlines again and again. Many traveled to courtrooms, enduring emotional exhaustion as the process stretched into the early 2000s. During these years, McVeigh maintained his defiance, but also began preparing for his own death. He declined to pursue some appeals, accelerating his execution date. It was as if he wanted to prove that even death could not make him submit to the government he despised. In letters to supporters, he wrote that his death would make him a martyr for liberty, a belief that deeply angered those who had lost loved ones in his attack. In early 2001, McVeigh's execution date was finally set for May 16, marking the first federal execution in the United States in nearly 4 decades. The announcement drew massive attention. Media outlets prepared coverage, while security in and around Terror Hot tightened. Survivors and families of victims were given the chance to witness the execution via closed circuit television from Oklahoma City. Many signed up, hoping to see the man responsible for their pain finally face the consequence of his actions. As the date approached, McVeigh remained eerily calm. He continued to correspond with his lawyer and a small group of supporters, but he refused all religious counseling. He insisted that his conscience was clear. "I have no need to seek forgiveness," he wrote. "I have nothing to apologize for." To some observers, his calmness seemed less like courage and more like a reflection of his complete detachment from humanity. Days before his execution, McVeigh was allowed a brief visit with his father and sister. The meeting was quiet, somber, and filled with unspoken grief. His father, William McVeigh, had lived under the shadow of his son's crime for years, enduring shame and harassment. When asked later about the visit, he said softly, "I just wanted to see my son one last time. He's still my boy." It was a heartbreaking reminder that tragedy spares no family, not even that of the guilty. In his final hours, McVeigh maintained his composure. He requested 2 pence of mint chocolate chip ice cream for his last meal. Nothing extravagant, just simple and cold. Perhaps fittingly so. He declined to make a verbal statement before the injection, choosing instead to distribute copies of William Ernest Henley's poem, Invictus. The same lines he had quoted at his sentencing now became his final message. "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." On June 11, 2001, Timothy McVeigh was executed by lethal injection. At 7:14 a.m., after a brief reading of his rights, the chemicals flowed into his veins. Within minutes, his eyes closed, his breathing slowed, and his life ended. Witnesses described the moment as eerily quiet. No words, no struggle, just stillness. For the victims' families watching, it was not celebration, but closure, a long-awaited end to a man who had caused immeasurable pain. In Oklahoma City, people gathered at the memorial built where the Murrah building once stood. Bells tolled 168 times, once for each life lost. Some cried, some prayed, others simply stood in silence. The memory of that day in April 1995 could never be erased. But McVeigh's death brought a measure of peace to many. Yet his execution also reignited debates about justice, the death penalty, and the nature of domestic terrorism. Some argued that executing McVeigh allowed him to escape punishment too easily, that true justice would have been a lifetime of reflection behind bars. Others believed his death was necessary, a final act of accountability for an unrepentant killer. For historians and law enforcement, McVeigh's life and death became a case study in radicalization. His transformation from soldier to mass murderer highlighted how ideology, when fueled by anger and isolation, could turn deadly. His story served as a warning that extremism was not confined to foreign threats. It could grow within America's own borders. As the years passed, McVeigh faded into history, but his impact remained. The Oklahoma City bombing changed the way the U.S. approached domestic terrorism, intelligence sharing, and extremist monitoring. The scars of that day continued to shape policy, security, and the national consciousness. McVeigh's death ended his physical presence, but his actions ensured he would never be forgotten. He had sought to challenge the government. But instead, he reminded a nation of the value of unity, resilience, and justice. While Timothy McVeigh's face became synonymous with the Oklahoma City bombing, another man lingered in the background. Terry Lynn Nichols, his former Army buddy, and the man accused of helping him plan the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in American history. Nichols never drove the truck, never lit the fuse, and never stood at the scene when the bomb exploded. But investigators were certain his hands were deep in the conspiracy that left 168 people dead and hundreds more wounded. In the immediate aftermath of the bombing, Nichols was not on the run like McVeigh. Instead, he was at home in Harrington, Kansas, with his family, living a quiet, ordinary life. But the FBI's net was tightening quickly. When agents traced McVeigh's movements, they found a trail that led straight to Nichols. Phone calls, letters, and shared purchases of explosive materials. On April 21, 1995, just 2 days after the bombing, Terry Nichols turned himself in to police, calm and cooperative. He denied any involvement in the attack, but admitted knowing McVeigh and helping him acquire materials for experiments. His explanation sounded hollow from the very beginning. The investigation soon revealed that Nichols had been McVeigh's partner in preparation. The two men had met during basic training at Fort Benning in 1988 and bonded over their growing distrust of the U.S. government. They shared long conversations about Waco, Ruby Ridge, and what they perceived as the erosion of American freedoms. For McVeigh, Nichols became the perfect companion, a man who quietly shared his anger but lacked his boldness. The FBI found that Nichols had helped McVeigh purchase and store the bomb components, including ammonium nitrate fertilizer, fuel oil, and detonation equipment. Evidence showed that Nichols rented storage units under false names, assisted in mixing materials, and even withdrew cash to fund their plan. Though he claimed he withdrew under pressure, the paper trail painted a picture of willing participation. Prosecutors would later describe Nichols as the indispensable helper, the man behind the scenes who made McVeigh's deadly vision possible. In December 1997, Nichols's federal trial began in Denver, the same city where McVeigh's trial had taken place. Once again, families of the victims filled the courtroom, determined to witness the continuation of justice. Unlike McVeigh, Nichols appeared reserved, often avoiding eye contact and speaking softly. His demeanor was that of a man who wanted to fade into the background, as though silence could shield him from the enormity of his actions. The prosecution's case was methodical. They laid out the evidence connecting Nichols to McVeigh's every move in the months leading up to April 19th, 1995. Receipts showed his purchases of fertilizer and diesel fuel. Witnesses testified that Nichols had helped rent storage sheds used to conceal bomb materials. Investigators also uncovered blueprints, timing devices, and notes linking him directly to the bomb's construction. But what truly condemned Nichols in the eyes of the jury was the emotional testimony of victims' families and survivors. Each one spoke of the devastating impact of the bombing, the loss of children, spouses, and friends. They wanted accountability, not just for McVeigh, but for anyone who had a hand in the atrocity. The defense, led by attorney Michael Tigar, argued that Nichols had been manipulated by McVeigh, a man far more dominant and charismatic. They claimed Nichols was a family man drawn into McVeigh's world through friendship and fear, not fanaticism. Tigar insisted that Nichols had no idea McVeigh would actually go through with the bombing. Terry Nichols, he told the jury, was guilty of trusting the wrong man, but not of mass murder. Despite the defense's efforts, the evidence of collaboration was overwhelming. The prosecution didn't need to prove Nichols detonated the bomb. They only had to show he knowingly participated in planning it. The FBI's findings, combined with Nichols's own admissions, made that case clear. On December 23, 1997, after 41 hours of deliberation, the jury reached its verdict. Nichols was found guilty of conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction and involuntary manslaughter for the deaths of 8 federal law enforcement officers. However, they could not agree on the death penalty. The split decision spared Nichols's life, and he was sentenced instead to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The outcome was met with mixed emotions. Some families were relieved that another participant had been held accountable. Others felt cheated of true justice. To them, Nichols's role had been crucial. Without his help, McVeigh might never have succeeded. As one survivor said outside the courthouse, he didn't light the fuse, but he carried the matches. After his federal conviction, Nichols faced additional state charges in Oklahoma for the murders of the remaining 160 victims. The state, unwilling to let him escape further responsibility, pursued another trial beginning in March 2004. This time, prosecutors sought the death penalty, arguing that Nichols had played an active, willing role in every step of the bombing. The state trial was even more emotional than the first. Survivors recounted horrific memories of the blast, parents describing how they searched the rubble for their children, firefighters reliving the gruesome rescue efforts, and witnesses recalling the thunderous explosion that shattered downtown Oklahoma City. Nichols's defense team again portrayed him as a man under McVeigh's influence, a reluctant follower rather than a co-conspirator. But his lack of remorse, even subtle, did him no favors. When asked if he wanted to address the victims' families, Nichols declined, saying only that words wouldn't change anything. His cold detachment mirrored McVeigh's earlier indifference, deepening the pain of those seeking closure. In May 2004, after weeks of testimony, the Oklahoma jury found Nichols guilty on all 161 counts of first-degree murder, as well as numerous conspiracy and arson charges. Yet again, the jury could not reach a unanimous decision on the death penalty. The result, another sentence of 161 consecutive life terms without parole. When the verdict was read, Nichols sat motionless. Behind him, quiet sobs filled the courtroom. The families had waited nearly a decade for this moment. Though some had hoped for a death sentence, most expressed relief that Nichols would spend the rest of his life behind bars, forgotten by the world outside. Nichols was transferred to ADX Florence, the nation's most secure supermax prison in Colorado, the same facility that would later house notorious criminals such as the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, and 9/11 conspirators. In Florence, inmates spend 23 hours a day in solitary confinement, sealed away in concrete cells designed to ensure they will never again harm another human being. From his cell, Nichols reportedly lived a quiet existence, reading the Bible, writing letters to his family, and maintaining his innocence. Unlike McVeigh, he did not court the media or express ideological defiance. His silence was his shield. But to many Americans, silence was not repentance, it was cowardice. Over time, Nichols faded from public consciousness. McVeigh had become the infamous face of the bombing, Nichols, the shadow behind him. Yet history would never forget his role in enabling the worst act of domestic terrorism in U.S. history. For the families of the 168 victims, the conviction of both men brought a measure of closure, though no verdict could bring back the lives lost. The justice system had spoken, but the emotional wounds of April 19, 1995 would echo for generations, as Oklahoma City slowly began to rebuild, both physically and spiritually. The trials of McVeigh and Nichols stood as grim reminders of the fragility of peace and the danger of unchecked hatred. In the days following the bombing, Oklahoma City felt like a city frozen in time. Smoke still drifted through the air. The twisted remains of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building stood as a haunting silhouette against the sky, a gaping wound in the heart of downtown. Cars were crushed, glass was shattered for blocks, and the sound of sirens never seemed to fade. For the people who lived there, April 19, 1995 wasn't just a date on a calendar. It was a dividing line between life before and life after. At first, the city moved through its grief in a blur of shock and disbelief. The sheer scale of destruction was incomprehensible. But within hours of the explosion, something extraordinary began to emerge from the chaos. A spirit of unity and compassion that would define Oklahoma City's recovery and inspire the entire nation. Ordinary citizens became heroes. Men and women who had never worn uniforms formed human chains to move debris by hand, searching for survivors. Strangers offered food, water, and comfort to rescuers who worked around the clock. Churches opened their doors for counseling and prayer. Volunteers arrived from across the country, bringing supplies, medical aid, and hope. The local hospitals were overwhelmed, yet they worked tirelessly. Doctors, nurses, and paramedics treated hundreds of victims, many with horrific injuries from flying debris and collapsing walls. They had to act fast, improvising surgeries, stitching wounds, and comforting those who had lost family members. The compassion in those hospital rooms became one of the first signs that even in devastation, humanity could shine through. The rescue and recovery operations continued for weeks. Crews dug through tons of rubble, sometimes in total silence, listening for faint cries or tapping sounds. When a survivor was found, the city erupted in cheers. When a body was recovered, workers paused, bowed their heads, and carried it out with honor. It didn't matter who the victims were. Federal employees, children, or passers-by. Each was treated with dignity. The phrase, Oklahoma Standard, was born from this shared spirit, a measure of kindness, resilience, and selflessness that became a lasting legacy. By May, the rescue mission had turned into recovery. Hope of finding anyone alive had faded, replaced by the grim task of identifying remains. The city's grief deepened. Funerals filled the weeks ahead, sometimes multiple in a single day. But amid sorrow, Oklahoma City refused to be defined by tragedy alone. Leaders, community members, and families of victims began to talk about rebuilding. Not just the city's skyline, but its soul. Mayor Ron Norick, Governor Frank Keating, and local officials coordinated efforts to restore the damaged downtown area. Donations poured in from around the world. Churches and civic organizations raised funds to support the victims' families. The people of Oklahoma City stood shoulder to shoulder, vowing that hate would not win. One of the most profound moments came from the survivors' families themselves. Instead of seeking vengeance, many spoke of healing and remembrance. They began to envision a memorial, not a monument of anger, but a place of peace. The idea of transforming the bombing site into a memorial park took root. The community wanted to ensure that future generations would never forget what happened, yet also understand the resilience that followed. The Oklahoma City National Memorial would eventually rise from that vision, a powerful symbol of loss and rebirth. But in 1995 and 1996, the focus was on recovery, both physical and emotional. Thousands of people sought therapy for post-traumatic stress, grief, and survivor's guilt. Counselors worked tirelessly to help families cope with nightmares and flashbacks. Children who survived the daycare bombing faced years of emotional healing. The city's schools integrated programs to support students affected by the tragedy. The faith community played a crucial role. Churches of all denominations came together, holding interfaith services where people prayed side by side regardless of their beliefs. In one powerful moment, a local pastor said, "Evil has had its day, but it will not have the last word." Those words became a rallying cry for a city determined to rebuild from ashes. Economically, Oklahoma City also faced enormous challenges. Downtown businesses had been destroyed, government offices displaced, and tourism halted. But instead of collapse, the tragedy sparked a renewal. Civic leaders began long-term urban revitalization plans. The MAPES initiative, Metropolitan Area Projects, which had begun before the bombing, suddenly gained momentum, becoming a symbol of hope for the future. Reconstruction wasn't just about buildings. It was about reclaiming identity. The Murrah building site was eventually cleared, but the memory of its destruction remained etched in everyone's minds. The lot, once filled with dust and twisted steel, became sacred ground. Survivors often visited the site just to sit in silence, to leave flowers, or to talk to loved ones they had lost. By the late 1990s, Oklahoma City began to transform from a city of sorrow to a city of strength. New buildings rose. Downtown businesses reopened. Festivals returned. The thunderous noise of construction replaced the haunting echo of the explosion. And with every nail driven and every wall rebuilt, residents reclaimed a piece of what the bombing had taken away. Through it all, the memorial movement grew stronger. Families, architects, and civic leaders collaborated to design a place that could embody both remembrance and renewal. After years of planning, their vision came to life in 2000 with the dedication of the Oklahoma City National Memorial and Museum. The memorial is unlike any other. It stands quietly on the same ground where the Murrah building once stood. Two massive bronze gates mark the exact times of the bombing, 9:01 and 9:03, the moments before and after the explosion. Between them lies the reflecting pool, a thin sheet of water representing calm and healing. Beside it are 168 empty bronze chairs, each symbolizing a life lost. The smaller chairs represent the children. At night, the chairs glow softly, casting a golden reflection over the water, a haunting yet peaceful reminder of those who never came home. Behind the memorial, the survivor tree, an American elm that withstood the blast, stands proudly. It had been scarred and nearly destroyed by the explosion, yet it lived. Its branches grew back stronger than ever. Today, that tree is one of the most powerful symbols of resilience, not only for Oklahoma City, but for anyone who has faced tragedy. Visitors from around the world come to the memorial each year, not just to mourn, but to learn. The accompanying museum tells the story of the bombing, the investigation, the trials, and the recovery. Interactive exhibits, survivor testimonies, and personal artifacts keep the memory alive. Every tour begins with a recording of the moment the bomb exploded, a chilling reminder of the human cost of hatred. For many survivors, visiting the memorial is both painful and healing. Some come to find peace. Others come to make sure the world never forgets. Parents bring children who weren't even born in 1995 to teach them what happens when fear and anger turn violent. The site has become more than a memorial. It's a promise that such darkness will never be allowed to take root again. In the years that followed, Oklahoma City's rebirth became a model for resilience worldwide. The phrase, the Oklahoma Standard, became a national term for compassion, generosity, and unity in times of crisis. It described not only how the city responded to tragedy, but how it chose to move forward with grace, strength, and community spirit. As the 10th anniversary approached in 2005, survivors, rescuers, and families gathered once more at the memorial. Bells tolled 168 times, one for each victim. Tears fell, but there was pride too, a pride born from pain and perseverance. One survivor summed it up best: they tried to break us. Instead, they showed the world who we really are. Oklahoma City's recovery was not just a story of rebuilding structures. It was a story of rebuilding hearts. The city that once echoed with sirens and grief became a symbol of unity and peace. Out of the rubble rose a community stronger than before, one that refused to be defined by an act of terror, but by its unwavering capacity to heal. When the bomb tore through the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building on April 19, 1995, it did more than destroy lives and property. It shattered America's sense of safety. For decades, the greatest threats to the United States had been perceived as external: foreign adversaries, wars overseas, or global terrorism. But the Oklahoma City bombing changed that narrative forever. It revealed a chilling truth. The deadliest acts of terror could come not from distant enemies, but from within the nation's own borders. In the immediate aftermath, the federal government was forced to reevaluate its understanding of domestic extremism. Before Oklahoma City, anti-government movements and militia groups had been seen largely as fringe or isolated, angry citizens with loud voices but limited reach. After the bombing, that perception vanished. Law enforcement realized that these groups were capable of sophisticated planning, large-scale violence, and deadly coordination. The investigation into Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols exposed an entire undercurrent of anti-government sentiment that had been festering across parts of America. Militia movements, white supremacist organizations, and paramilitary groups preparing for what they called a war against tyranny. Many traced their anger back to Ruby Ridge, 1992, and Waco, 1993. Two government standoffs that had ended in bloodshed. McVeigh himself had been radicalized by those events, seeing them as proof that the U.S. government had turned against its people. As the nation mourned, federal agencies began a rapid and comprehensive reassessment of their counterterrorism strategies. The FBI, which had previously focused primarily on international threats, created a new division dedicated to domestic terrorism. Intelligence gathering, interagency communication, and data sharing were all intensified. For the first time, domestic extremist groups, especially those with anti-government ideologies, were treated as serious national security concerns. Attorney General Janet Reno, still haunted by her role in Waco, took swift action to strengthen cooperation between federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies. The goal was to prevent another Oklahoma City by improving how agencies tracked, monitored, and shared information about potential threats. The tragedy had exposed weaknesses in communication and intelligence coordination, flaws that McVeigh had exploited. In 1996, Congress passed the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, AEDPA, one of the most significant pieces of legislation to emerge from the bombing. The law expanded federal powers to investigate terrorism, restricted appeal processes for convicted terrorists, and improved the ability of law enforcement to pursue individuals suspected of plotting violent acts. It also made it easier for federal authorities to prosecute those who provided material support to terrorist activities, whether domestic or foreign. However, the act sparked debate. Civil liberties advocates worried that it gave the government too much power, potentially infringing on free speech and due process. But for many Americans still reeling from the horror of 168 deaths, including 19 children, stronger laws felt like a necessary safeguard. The balance between security and freedom would become a defining issue in the years that followed. The Oklahoma City bombing also marked a turning point in how law enforcement approached explosives and large vehicle threats. The FBI and ATF's Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives began developing new forensic methods for analyzing bomb scenes and tracking chemical components. The bombing investigation became a blueprint for future cases, meticulous, technology-driven, and multi-jurisdictional. Public buildings across the country underwent major security reviews. Bollards, concrete barriers, and reinforced structures became standard features around federal facilities. Vehicle access was restricted near sensitive sites, and new protocols were established for suspicious packages or abandoned vehicles. The term truck bomb entered the American vocabulary as a symbol of vulnerability and the urgent need to protect public spaces from unconventional threats. The FBI also launched Project Megiddo in 1999, a nationwide initiative aimed at identifying potential domestic threats related to extremist ideologies. The project examined groups motivated by religious prophecy, white supremacy, or anti-government beliefs. It warned that the kind of hatred that fueled McVeigh still existed and could erupt again if ignored. Though controversial, it signaled a new era of proactive monitoring and prevention. Yet, beyond the agencies and laws, the most profound change was cultural. The Oklahoma City bombing forced Americans to confront an uncomfortable question. What happens when our own citizens become the enemy? It wasn't an easy question to answer. McVeigh wasn't a foreign invader. He was an American veteran, born in New York, raised on patriotic ideals, and once proud to serve his country. That fact shook the nation to its core. The image of an ordinary young man turning into a domestic terrorist challenged assumptions about what radicalization looked like. It wasn't about geography or nationality. It was about ideology and anger. In classrooms, universities, and law enforcement academies, the Oklahoma City bombing became a case study in radicalization psychology. Experts examined how isolation, resentment, and exposure to extremist propaganda could transform individuals into extremists. These insights later informed training programs for counterterrorism agents and community outreach initiatives designed to identify early warning signs of violent radicalization. The tragedy also reshaped the media's role in covering terrorism. After the bombing, news organizations faced criticism for inadvertently amplifying extremist messages. McVeigh's televised interviews, where he quoted militant literature and justified his actions, raised ethical questions about how much attention should be given to domestic terrorists. Networks began developing new guidelines for reporting on violent extremism, avoiding glorification while still informing the public. Perhaps most importantly, the bombing forged a deeper bond between law enforcement and the public. In the wake of the attack, communities across the nation rallied around their local police, firefighters, and emergency responders. The bravery of Oklahoma City's first responders became legendary. Ordinary men and women who had run toward danger when others ran away. Their heroism inspired new investments in training, equipment, and emergency preparedness across the country. For the FBI, Oklahoma City was both a tragedy and a wake-up call. It exposed the limits of the Bureau's preparedness, but also showcased its capacity for rapid innovation. By the late 1990s, the FBI's domestic terrorism units had become more advanced, integrating behavioral analysis, technology, and intelligence sharing like never before. The lessons learned would later influence the agency's response to another catastrophic event, September 11, 2001. In many ways, Oklahoma City served as the precursor to America's modern war on terror. It redefined the national security landscape, setting the stage for new legislation, intelligence operations, and homeland security initiatives that would follow in the next decade. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the bombing's aftermath was not just in how the government changed, but in how Americans saw themselves. The attack reminded the nation that freedom and safety were fragile, that vigilance was essential, and that hate could grow anywhere, even at home. 20 years later, FBI Director James Comey would reflect on the bombing by saying, "Oklahoma City taught us that terrorism has no single face, no single language, and no single religion. It is born from grievance and fear, and it thrives in silence." Those words echo the lasting truth of April 19, 1995, that the greatest strength of a nation lies not in its walls or weapons, but in its unity. As the 20th century came to a close, the memory of Oklahoma City stood as both a warning and a testament. A warning of how ideology can destroy, and a testament to how compassion can rebuild. The Oklahoma City bombing didn't just scar a city. It reshaped an entire nation's psyche. When the dust settled and the investigations concluded, the lessons it left behind became embedded deep within America's counterterrorism framework. Those lessons, painful and raw, would later resurface with haunting relevance on another tragic morning, September 11, 2001. In the 6 years between Oklahoma City and 9/11, the United States had entered a new era of vigilance. The bombing had already shown that massive acts of terror could be planned and executed on American soil by its own citizens. The horror of that April morning in 1995 had forced intelligence agencies to widen their lens, to consider both foreign and domestic threats as equally lethal. What few could foresee was that the tactics, responses, and inter-agency reforms inspired by Oklahoma City would form the foundation of the nation's reaction to the most devastating terrorist attack in its history. In the aftermath of the Oklahoma City bombing, federal agencies like the FBI, ATF, and FEMA began integrating new protocols for emergency management, intelligence coordination, and crisis response. The Incident Command System, ICS, a structured approach to managing complex emergencies, was refined through lessons learned from Oklahoma City. It allowed for seamless coordination between police, fire, medical, and federal teams during major disasters. By 2001, that very system was already in place, standing ready for the unimaginable. The Oklahoma City tragedy had also revealed the power of forensic science in solving acts of terror. The meticulous work of the FBI's bomb technicians, evidence analysts, and behavioral experts in tracing McVeigh's movements became a model for future investigations. When the Twin Towers fell, that same discipline, painstaking evidence recovery, and multi-agency collaboration would once again be tested on a far greater scale. But beyond tactical lessons, Oklahoma City influenced the national conversation about extremism, ideology, and the blurred line between dissent and danger. It exposed how conspiracy theories and government distrust could metastasize into deadly violence. After 1995, analysts began mapping extremist movements in unprecedented detail, tracking militia gatherings, anti-government rhetoric, and hate group recruitment online. By the late 1990s, as the internet grew, so did the concern. Extremist ideas that once circulated in pamphlets and gun shows now found new life on digital forums. The Oklahoma City bombing had been a warning of what could happen when ideology turned lethal. 9/11 would reveal what could happen when technology gave extremism a global reach. Yet, despite the vigilance sparked by Oklahoma City, America was still unprepared for the magnitude of the 9/11 attacks. The systems and intelligence reforms inspired by 1995 were incomplete. There were still silos between agencies, miscommunications between intelligence and law enforcement, and bureaucratic barriers that delayed critical information sharing. The tragedy in Oklahoma had shown what needed to change, but those lessons hadn't yet been fully realized. In a strange way, Timothy McVeigh and Osama bin Laden shared a similar legacy. They both forced the U.S. government to confront the evolving nature of terrorism. McVeigh represented the face of homegrown extremism, motivated by ideology, paranoia, and revenge. Bin Laden embodied international jihadist terrorism, driven by a global religious, political agenda. One was domestic, the other foreign, but both proved that terror was not bound by nationality. After 9/11, as the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, was created, many of its architects pointed back to Oklahoma City as an early blueprint. The disaster had demonstrated the importance of unified command, federal funding for emergency preparedness, and communication interoperability among agencies. The concept of Homeland Security itself was partially born from the ashes of Oklahoma City, long before it became a government department. The bombing also left a moral lesson that shaped America's post-9/11 response: the danger of letting grief turn into prejudice. After Oklahoma City, initial media speculation wrongly suggested that Middle Eastern terrorists might be responsible. This led to a wave of anti-Arab hate crimes before McVeigh's arrest proved that the killer was, in fact, a white American veteran. That misjudgment became a powerful cautionary tale, a reminder that fear could easily become misdirected hate. Yet, after 9/11, the same mistake was repeated on a much larger scale. Muslim and Arab Americans faced discrimination, suspicion, and violence. Many civil rights advocates pointed back to Oklahoma City, reminding the nation that terrorism had no single race, faith, or origin. The bombing's earlier lesson was clear: evil can wear any face. The Oklahoma City National Memorial, dedicated in 2000, stood as a physical reminder of those lessons. When the Twin Towers fell, visitors to the memorial left tributes not only for the 168 who died in 1995, but also for the thousands lost in 2001. The two tragedies became intertwined in America's collective memory, bookends of a new age of fear and resilience. The media, too, evolved. In 1995, live television coverage of Oklahoma City had shocked viewers nationwide, bringing the reality of domestic terrorism into their homes. By 2001, the 24-hour news cycle and digital media landscape amplified that experience 100-fold. Both events changed how Americans consumed information, trusted institutions, and understood the global reach of violence. Law enforcement training, emergency drills, and community outreach programs that began after Oklahoma City expanded after 9/11. Federal funds poured into local police departments to improve communication technology, intelligence analysis, and counterterrorism units. Many of these programs were built directly upon the frameworks developed in response to the 1995 bombing. Perhaps the deepest influence, however, was emotional. The Oklahoma City bombing had been a test of empathy, a moment when Americans proved capable of immense compassion, selflessness, and unity. People from every corner of the country had sent aid, blood donations, and prayers. That same spirit reappeared after 9/11. The unity that filled the streets of New York mirrored the compassion that had filled the streets of Oklahoma City 6 years earlier. Both tragedies revealed the best and worst of humanity. They showed how easily ideology could destroy and how powerfully love could rebuild. The first responders who dug through the rubble in 1995 laid the moral groundwork for those who climbed the smoking towers in 2001. Both groups became symbols of courage and endurance, proof that even when terror strikes, the human spirit endures. In retrospect, the Oklahoma City bombing was not just a domestic incident. It was a precursor, a warning of a new kind of war that would soon engulf the world. A war not fought between nations, but between beliefs, between light and darkness, between those who build and those who destroy. As the 21st century began, America carried forward the scars and the wisdom of 1995. Every security checkpoint, every emergency drill, every interagency briefing bore traces of Oklahoma City's lessons. It was the attack that made the impossible imaginable, and in doing so, prepared a nation for what was to come. The story of the Oklahoma City bombing does not end with the blast, the arrests, or even the trials. Its truest ending, and perhaps its most powerful beginning, lies in the hearts of those who lived through it. The survivors, rescuers, and families of the victims became the living continuation of that tragic day, carrying both the pain of loss and the determination to rebuild. Out of the wreckage of terror, they forged something extraordinary: resilience, remembrance, and renewal. When the Murrah Federal Building collapsed at 9:02 a.m. on April 19, 1995, the explosion tore through lives in an instant. But survival was only the first step of an enduring battle. For many who escaped the rubble, the real struggle began afterward, in hospitals, in therapy, in sleepless nights haunted by memories. Hundreds of survivors carried physical scars, burns, broken bones, shrapnel wounds, but the invisible injuries were often worse. Post-traumatic stress disorder, survivor's guilt, and anxiety lingered long after the news cameras left. Parents who lost children, workers who lost colleagues, and rescuers who pulled lifeless bodies from the debris all faced the same unbearable question: why did I survive? One survivor, Florence Rogers, who led the Federal Employees Credit Union, located in the Murrah Building, stood at her desk when the bomb detonated. In an instant, her 9 employees vanished. They had been seated around her only seconds before. Florence survived because the blast force pushed her backward, away from the implosion. In her grief, she became an advocate for compassion and remembrance, later serving on the committee that helped design the Oklahoma City National Memorial. Rescue workers, too, carried the trauma. Firefighters, police officers, medical teams, and volunteers spent weeks combing through the ruins, often working around the clock. The first responders who entered the collapsed building faced an apocalyptic scene. Twisted steel, pulverized concrete, and the silence of hundreds buried beneath. Many of them later said, it was unlike anything they had ever seen before, not even in war. The rescue and recovery effort lasted 16 days, ending on May 5, 1995. During that time, rescuers recovered the bodies of 168 people. They also rescued dozens who had been trapped alive. Every life saved was a moment of hope amid tragedy, a reminder that courage could still outshine horror. In the years that followed, Oklahoma City became known for something deeper than destruction. It became known for its resilience across the nation. People began to speak of the Oklahoma Standard, a phrase that captured the city's extraordinary response. Neighbor helping neighbor, strangers opening their homes, volunteers working without rest. Blood drives overflowed. Restaurants cooked meals for rescue workers. Churches offered shelter and counseling. What made the Oklahoma Standard so remarkable was its simplicity. It was humanity at its purest. When the worst of humanity struck, the best of humanity rose to meet it. For many families of victims, grief turned into activism. Parents who lost children founded scholarship funds, memorial organizations, and trauma support networks. Bud and Jeanne Welch, whose daughter Julie died in the blast, became outspoken advocates against the death penalty, even for Timothy McVeigh. They believed that responding to violence with more violence would only perpetuate the pain. Their forgiveness became a profound example of moral strength, echoing far beyond Oklahoma. Kathy Sanders, who lost her 2 grandsons in the bombing, struggled for years with grief and anger. But over time, she transformed that anguish into purpose, dedicating her life to promoting peace, forgiveness, and understanding. Her story, like many others, showed how personal tragedy can lead to collective healing. The Oklahoma City National Memorial and Museum, dedicated on April 19, 2000, stands as both a grave and a symbol. Its design was rooted in reflection and rebirth. 2 bronze gates mark the moments before and after the blast 901, representing innocence, and 1903, representing the moment the world changed. Between them lies a serene, reflecting pool, symbolizing calm and remembrance. The field of empty chairs, 168 in total, represents each life lost. The smaller chairs, 19 of them, honor the children killed in the building's daycare center. At night, the chairs glow softly, their light casting a quiet, haunting beauty across the site. Visitors often describe it as both devastating and peaceful, a sacred space where grief and grace coexist. Inside the adjacent museum, visitors walk through exhibits filled with artifacts, photographs, and recorded testimonies. One of the most chilling displays is a recording of a water board meeting held across the street that morning, the only known audio capturing the explosion itself. Visitors hear the calm of ordinary business, then the deafening roar of the blast, followed by silence. It is a moment frozen in time, a reminder of how quickly normalcy can turn to nightmare. But the museum is not only about death, it is also about survival, hope, and community. Interactive exhibits share stories of recovery, showcasing how citizens rebuilt their city and their lives. The message is clear: evil may shatter buildings, but it cannot shatter the human spirit. Every April 19th, survivors' families and citizens gather at the memorial for the remembrance ceremony. At 9:02 a.m., the exact time of the explosion, a moment of silence blankets the crowd. Bells toll. Names are read aloud, one by one. It is a ritual of remembrance, an act of defiance against forgetting. Over the years, survivors have become ambassadors of healing, traveling across the country to share their experiences. They speak to students, first responders, and community groups, reminding audiences that tragedy does not have to define us. It can refine us. Their voices have helped others recover from later tragedies, including 9/11, the Boston Marathon bombing, and countless school shootings. The Oklahoma City Survivor Tree, an American elm that stood just yards from the blast, became one of the most enduring symbols of resilience. Scarred and stripped of leaves, many believed it would die. Yet, against all odds, it lived. New branches sprouted from its wounded trunk. Today, it stands tall at the memorial's heart, surrounded by a circular deck engraved with the words, "The spirit of this city and this nation will not be defeated. Our deeply rooted faith sustains us." Saplings from the survivor tree are now planted in cities across the United States, linking communities of tragedy and recovery. They serve as living reminders that life persists, even after devastation. Perhaps the greatest lesson from the survivors of Oklahoma City is this: healing is not forgetting. It is remembering differently. It is choosing to let love be louder than hate. It is standing amid the ruins and deciding to build again. In many ways, the survivors became the true authors of Oklahoma City's legacy. While McVeigh sought to break the nation's spirit, they proved that compassion and unity could not be bombed away. Their stories of forgiveness, endurance, and hope transformed Oklahoma City from a site of terror into a global symbol of resilience. As the years passed, the city itself flourished again. New businesses, modern buildings, and thriving neighborhoods rose where rubble once lay. But the people never forgot. Every corner of Oklahoma City still carries the echo of that April morning, balanced by a quiet promise: never again and never forgotten. The story of the Oklahoma City bombing could not be complete without its most chilling figure, Timothy James McVeigh, the man who turned a truck filled with fertilizer and diesel fuel into a weapon of mass destruction. His arrest, trial, and execution would become one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in American history. A confrontation between a nation's demand for justice and its struggle to comprehend how one of its own could commit such evil. When McVeigh was arrested on April 19, 1995, just 90 minutes after the bombing, few could have imagined how meticulously he had planned his crime. he was stopped for a missing license plate, wearing a T-shirt printed with the Latin phrase, Sic semper tyrannis, thus always to tyrants, the same words John Wilkes Booth shouted after assassinating President Abraham Lincoln. To McVeigh, the bombing was not an act of terror, it was, in his warped view, an act of war against what he believed was a tyrannical government. The case against McVeigh was built swiftly and powerfully. Investigators traced the Ryder rental truck back to him, found receipts for fertilizer and fuel, and recovered fragments of his fingerprints from bomb-related materials. He had left behind a paper trail of anger and obsession, letters railing against the government, and books like the Turner Diaries, which glorified violent revolution. Because the bombing had killed so many and deeply shaken public confidence, federal prosecutors knew they had to handle the case with precision. The trial was moved from Oklahoma City to Denver, Colorado, to ensure an impartial jury. Presiding over the proceedings was Judge Richard P. Match, a man known for his fairness and quiet authority. The lead prosecutor, Joseph Hartzler, and his team represented not only the victims, but also the integrity of American justice. McVeigh's defense attorney, Stephen Jones, faced an impossible task, defending a man who had already admitted moral responsibility for the bombing, but not legal guilt. McVeigh never denied setting the bomb. Instead, he argued that he was acting out of patriotism, striking back against what he perceived as government tyranny, particularly after the Waco siege in 1993. He saw himself as a soldier in a self-declared war. During the trial, the prosecution meticulously reconstructed the events leading to April 19. They presented over 137 witnesses and more than 1,000 pieces of evidence. The testimony was devastating. Survivors describing the horror of the explosion, emergency workers recounting the carnage, and investigators linking every element of the bomb to McVeigh's purchases and movements. One of the most emotional moments came when prosecutors displayed photographs of the 19 children killed in the building's daycare center. The courtroom fell silent. Jurors wept. Even McVeigh, who rarely showed emotion, looked away. For the victims' families, those moments were unbearable but necessary. A confrontation with the human cost of his actions. McVeigh's defense team tried to cast doubt on whether he had acted alone, suggesting that a larger conspiracy might have been involved. They argued that McVeigh was being scapegoated by a government eager to demonstrate strength after its failures at Waco and Ruby Ridge. But the evidence was overwhelming. Terry Nichols, McVeigh's friend and accomplice, had helped build the bomb, but McVeigh was the architect and executor of the plan. When McVeigh took the stand, he did not testify. He showed no remorse, no plea for forgiveness, no recognition of the suffering he caused. To him, the bombing was a statement, not a crime. His silence was chilling, and it hardened the resolve of the jury. After 23 days of testimony and 23 hours of deliberation, on June 2, 1997, the jury returned a verdict: guilty on all 11 counts of murder and conspiracy. When the sentence was read, death by lethal injection, there was no visible reaction from McVeigh. He stared ahead, calm and expressionless, as if his fate had no meaning. For many in Oklahoma City, the verdict brought relief but not closure. Nothing could bring back the 168 lives lost. Still, the trial's fairness and transparency gave the victims' families something McVeigh had denied them on April 19, a sense of justice and dignity. The sentencing phase revealed even more about McVeigh's psyche. He gave interviews from his cell, rationalizing his actions as a necessary evil. He told reporters he regretted that the bombing hadn't sparked the anti-government uprising he hoped for. To the end, he framed himself not as a murderer, but as a revolutionary. His lack of remorse only deepened public revulsion. Meanwhile, his co-conspirator Terry Nichols was tried separately. Nichols was convicted of conspiracy and involuntary manslaughter, but spared the death penalty. He received multiple life sentences without parole. Another associate, Michael Fortier, who knew about the plan but failed to report it, cooperated with prosecutors and received a reduced sentence. As McVeigh awaited execution, debates raged across the country. Some saw the death penalty as justice served. Others, including several victims' families, believed that executing McVeigh would perpetuate the same cycle of violence he had begun. Among them were Bud and Jan Welch, who spoke publicly against his execution, saying that forgiveness, not revenge, was the only true path to healing. Still, the overwhelming public sentiment favored execution. McVeigh had taken innocent lives on a scale unprecedented in modern American history. His lack of remorse erased any hope of clemency. On June 11, 2001, at the Federal Correctional Complex in Terre Haute, Indiana, Timothy McVeigh was executed by lethal injection. His death marked the first federal execution in 38 years. More than 300 survivors and family members watched the execution via closed-circuit television. For some, it was a moment of closure. For others, a haunting end to a nightmare that had never really ended. Just before his execution, McVeigh handed a handwritten statement to prison officials. It was a poem, Invictus, by William Ernest Henley, a defiant declaration of self, mastery, and pride. Its final line read, "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." Even in death, McVeigh refused to acknowledge guilt. As the lethal drugs entered his veins, he remained expressionless. Within minutes, his chest rose once, then fell. At 7:14 a.m., he was pronounced dead. Outside the prison, protesters and mourners stood in separate groups, some holding signs of peace, others of vengeance. The execution closed a dark chapter in American history, but left lingering questions about justice, ideology, and the capacity for evil within the human heart. For many, McVeigh's death was not an end, but a reminder. Domestic terrorism was not a relic of the past. It was an ongoing threat. The Oklahoma City bombing trial became a template for future terrorism prosecutions. It demonstrated the balance between due process and national security, between law and emotion. It proved that even in the face of unspeakable atrocity, America could hold to its principles of fairness and transparency. For the families of the victims, justice came not through vengeance, but through the reaffirmation of those very values McVeigh sought to destroy. In the courtroom, Amid the pain and the memories, they witnessed something enduring, that the rule of law would outlast hate, and that truth, however painful, would prevail. When the echoes of the explosion faded and the rubble was cleared, the Oklahoma City bombing left behind more than shattered glass and broken stone. It left a nation forever changed. The tragedy had altered the landscape of America's understanding of terrorism, violence, and civic responsibility. It wasn't just an event confined to 1995. It became a continuing presence, shaping laws, psychology, architecture, and even the nation's collective identity for decades to come. In the years following the bombing, the wounds of that April morning rippled outward. Survivors rebuilt their lives, families mourned their dead, and law enforcement evolved. Yet the psychological, cultural, and political aftershocks continued to echo far beyond Oklahoma City. The attack became a permanent reference point in how America viewed domestic threats and how it defined the very idea of safety. One of the most immediate and enduring impacts was the transformation of federal building security across the United States. Before 1995, most government facilities were open, approachable, and largely unguarded. The Murrah building had been no exception. It was designed to be welcoming, reflecting a belief that public service should remain close to the people. McVeigh's bomb destroyed that ideal. In the aftermath, security became paramount. Federal buildings were retrofitted with blast-resistant materials, reinforced walls, and restricted vehicle access. Parking was moved farther away. Concrete barriers, bollards, and perimeter fences became standard. New structures incorporated standoff distances, ensuring that vehicles could not approach too closely. The open accessibility that had once symbolized democracy was now overshadowed by the necessity of defense. Oklahoma City also changed how the United States approached emergency preparedness and interagency coordination. The failure to anticipate or prevent such an attack forced a reevaluation of how local and federal agencies communicated. The FBI, ATF, FEMA, and local first responders learned hard lessons about cooperation, resource sharing, and the importance of clear command structures. These lessons later became the backbone of the Homeland Security framework that emerged after 9/11. Beyond the realm of security, the bombing left an indelible mark on American culture and consciousness. For the first time in the modern era, terrorism had a distinctly American face. The realization that one of their own, a white, decorated Gulf War veteran, could commit such devastation shocked the nation to its core. It forced citizens to confront uncomfortable truths about alienation, extremism, and the fragility of trust in institutions. Communities began to look inward, grappling with the question of how ideological hatred could grow unchecked within ordinary people. In schools, civic organizations, and universities, discussions about radicalization, propaganda, and government distrust intensified. The Oklahoma City bombing became a cautionary tale about how disinformation and extremist rhetoric could metastasize into real-world violence. In this sense, McVeigh's legacy became a dark mirror for future generations. His writings, interviews, and justifications circulated online, unintentionally became rallying material for later extremists. Law enforcement had to balance constitutional rights with vigilance, carefully monitoring hate groups, militias, and online forums while safeguarding free speech. The bombing blurred the boundaries between ideology and criminality, between dissent and danger. Meanwhile, for the people of Oklahoma City, the decades that followed were about reclamation and resilience. The scars remained visible, but they were transformed into symbols of unity. The Oklahoma City National Memorial and Museum, with its tranquil reflecting pool and 168 glowing chairs, became not only a tribute to the dead, but also a living classroom for peace. School groups, military cadets, and world leaders visited to learn what hate had destroyed and what love had rebuilt. The memorial's survivor tree, once blackened by fire and stripped of leaves, continued to flourish. Each spring, its branches reached higher, a quiet reminder that healing is not the absence of pain, but the persistence of life. Saplings from the tree were planted across the country, linking communities touched by tragedy, from New York to Boston to Las Vegas, under a shared message of resilience. But the emotional and psychological legacy endured in subtler ways. Survivors reported ongoing trauma even decades later. The sound of a car backfiring, the smell of diesel fuel, or the sight of a Ryder truck could trigger flashbacks. Therapists coined the term Oklahoma Syndrome to describe the long-term psychological effects of surviving mass casualty events, grief that ebbs and flows, never fully disappearing. For first responders, the memories were just as haunting. Firefighters and police officers who had pulled bodies from the wreckage often battled survivors' guilt and post-traumatic stress disorder. Many turned to advocacy, pushing for better mental health support for emergency workers. The idea that heroes need healing too became part of the national dialogue. Politically, the bombing shifted how lawmakers approached domestic extremism. It inspired the 1996 Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, strengthening the government's ability to investigate and prosecute terrorists. While controversial, it reflected a new urgency in combating threats from within. Later, after 9/11, these foundations expanded into a broader counterterrorism strategy that fused intelligence gathering with public safety initiatives. In the cultural realm, Oklahoma City's story continued to inspire filmmakers, authors, and journalists. Documentaries revisited the tragedy through new lenses: psychological, social, and historical. Dramatizations and investigative works dissected McVeigh's motives, not to glorify him, but to understand how ideology can mutate into violence. For many Americans, the bombing remained a reference point when new tragedies struck. After each mass shooting, hate crime, or domestic terror plot, commentators evoked Oklahoma City as a reminder of how hatred, once ignited, can devastate lives. The phrase, "another Oklahoma City," became shorthand for the unimaginable, a tragedy born from within. At the same time, the spirit of unity that followed the bombing became a model for national response. When 9/11 occurred, many New Yorkers said they looked to Oklahoma City for guidance on how to heal. The Oklahoma standard: selflessness, empathy, and resilience. was cited in speeches and community rebuilding efforts across the country. The bombing also accelerated discussions about radicalization prevention. Programs emerged to identify early warning signs of extremism in schools, workplaces, and online spaces. Civic leaders began promoting dialogue and education as tools against hate. In that sense, the tragedy's aftermath became a source of prevention, a way to ensure that the seeds of violence would not take root again. Even today, the bombing's presence lingers in subtle yet profound ways. Security screenings at government buildings, anti-terrorism task forces, surveillance technologies, and even the term domestic terrorism owe much of their evolution to Oklahoma City. It was the event that forced the nation to see that terrorism was not a foreign import. It could be homegrown, ideological, and deceptively ordinary. And yet, the ultimate legacy of the Oklahoma City bombing is not one of fear. It is one of remembrance and resilience. The tragedy showed the depths of human cruelty, but it also revealed the heights of human compassion. It proved that a city and a nation could absorb unimaginable pain and still emerge united. Every April 19th, as dawn breaks over the reflecting pool, the names of the 168 victims are read aloud. Bells ring across Oklahoma City. Tears flow. The silence that follows is not one of despair, but of reverence. The city remembers not just how it suffered, but how it stood together. As the decades pass, new generations visit the memorial, many of them born long after 1995. They walk among the empty chairs, listen to the stories, and carry away an understanding that history is not just something that happened. It is something that warns, teaches, and inspires. In the aftermath of the Oklahoma City bombing, America's sense of safety fractured. It wasn't just about the destruction of a single building. It was the realization that terror could come from within, from someone who looked like a neighbor, wore a soldier's uniform, and spoke the language of patriotism. The bombing shattered the psychological illusion that threats always came from the outside. It created a new kind of fear, the fear of betrayal by one's own. Before April 19, 1995, the word terrorism in the American mind was almost exclusively foreign. It evoked images of hijackings in the Middle East or attacks in distant lands. But when the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building collapsed, killing 168 people, including 19 children, the enemy suddenly had an American face. The nation had to wrestle with a new, uncomfortable truth. The line between patriotism and extremism could blur dangerously. The psychological fallout rippled across communities. Trust in strangers, in public spaces, even in government, took a heavy blow. Parents felt unsafe sending their children to daycare centers housed in office buildings. Workers grew anxious about walking into federal facilities. Cities began rethinking the design of public spaces. What had once been open and communal became shielded and distant. The collective trauma went deeper than fear of another attack. It touched something fundamental in the American identity. The Oklahoma City bombing forced people to ask, who are we when our own citizens turn against us? In many ways, it mirrored the disillusionment of earlier decades. Vietnam, Watergate, the Cold War paranoia. But now the distrust was internal. It wasn't about foreign spies or distant wars. It was about ideology, resentment, and rage festering in plain sight. The narrative of versus them no longer fit because them was us. Television coverage of the bombing, replayed endlessly, embedded itself in the nation's psyche. The image of the Murrah building's ripped facade, the firemen carrying infants from the rubble, and the stunned survivors covered in dust, all became symbols of vulnerability. People across the country watched in disbelief, feeling the invisible tremors of insecurity reach their own towns. Psychologists later described the nation's reaction as a mass trauma event. Even those not directly connected to Oklahoma City reported feelings of anxiety, dread, and anger. News media and talk shows filled with discussions about militia movements, gun control, and government overreach. The word extremist became part of everyday vocabulary. And yet, amid the fear, something else grew, a profound resilience. Americans responded with compassion that transcended politics and geography. Donations, blood drives, and volunteer efforts poured into Oklahoma from every corner of the country. People who had never met each other shared grief, prayers, and hope. That unity became known as the Oklahoma Standard, a cultural shorthand for empathy and service in the face of disaster. Still, beneath that unity lingered unease. Citizens wanted to believe the bombing was an isolated act, but deep down, many sensed it wasn't. Extremist groups across the nation celebrated McVeigh as a martyr. Law enforcement quietly expanded its surveillance of anti-government organizations. The internet, still young at the time, became a breeding ground for conspiracies and hatred that echoed McVeigh's ideology. The psychological war wasn't just about catching terrorists anymore. It was about preventing the conditions that bred them. The government launched education programs, counseling initiatives, and early intervention networks designed to identify radicalization. But fear had already changed American behavior. People became more cautious, more watchful, and sometimes more suspicious of those who thought differently. In the homes of survivors, the struggle was more intimate. Parents who lost children carried wounds that time could never close. Workers who survived the blast suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, reliving the explosion in their dreams, in loud noises, in the smell of diesel fuel. Some survivors couldn't step into tall buildings again. Others couldn't bear to celebrate birthdays that fell on April 19. For many, grief transformed into activism. Survivors and families of victims spoke publicly about unity, peace, and forgiveness. They founded scholarship funds and memorial programs to turn pain into purpose. Some advocated for stricter laws against hate crimes and domestic terrorism, determined that no other city would endure what Oklahoma had. But forgiveness came with its own struggles. The survivors' courtroom testimonies, often delivered directly to McVeigh, revealed the complex human reactions to evil, rage, sorrow, and even empathy. Some wanted him to die, others wanted answers. A few, remarkably, wanted to forgive. The bombing had become not just a national tragedy, but a moral test. Could a society built on justice also embrace mercy? In broader culture, The Oklahoma City bombing forced America to redefine terrorism itself. It wasn't merely about religion or nationality anymore. It was about ideology, radicalization, and the dangers of isolation. That understanding would later shape the country's response to future attacks, including 9/11. Sociologists noted a rise in collective anxiety, a persistent fear that something could explode anywhere, at any time. It was no longer paranoia, it was lived experience. This anxiety seeped into schools, workplaces, and even entertainment. Hollywood thrillers began to explore domestic conspiracies. News outlets featured experts on homegrown extremism. The trust that once bound communities together began to feel fragile. And yet, even within that fragility, a certain American stubbornness endured. People rebuilt. They attended memorial services not out of fear, but out of defiance. They walked past new security barriers and metal detectors as an act of normalcy. The nation learned to live with vigilance without surrendering completely to paranoia. By the early 2000s, the Oklahoma City bombing had become both a symbol of vulnerability and strength. It reminded the world that democracy is not invincible, but it is resilient. The pain that once divided Americans now served as a reminder of shared humanity, a bond forged in tragedy. For the psychologists, counselors, and clergy who worked with survivors, the years following the bombing revealed an essential truth. Healing does not mean forgetting. Healing means carrying the memory forward, using it to teach, to warn, and to rebuild stronger foundations of trust. Today, every April 19th, as the names of the 168 victims are read aloud, the silence that follows feels heavy, but hopeful. It's a silence filled with reflection, a collective acknowledgement of both fear and fortitude. The American psyche, scarred yet unbroken, continues to evolve. The bombing's legacy lives not in the violence of its moment, but in the quiet resilience that followed. It reshaped not just buildings or laws, but hearts and minds. It taught America that trust is fragile. Freedom requires vigilance, and unity, though tested, remains its greatest defense. When the smoke cleared from the ruins of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, the nation turned to its television screens. Reporters swarmed Oklahoma City, helicopters circled overhead, and every major network broadcast the haunting image of the building's shattered face. The Oklahoma City bombing was no longer just a tragedy. It was a story unfolding in real time, shaping how America understood terrorism, grief, and justice. The media's response was immediate, emotional, and all-encompassing. For days, networks provided 24-hour coverage, interviewing first responders, survivors, and eyewitnesses. Anchors struggled to maintain composure as they described the rescue of infants from the wreckage and the frantic search for survivors. In living rooms across the country, Americans cried with strangers they would never meet. But as the story evolved, so did its focus. The question of who had done this consumed the nation. Early speculation was wild. Many news outlets initially assumed foreign terrorists were responsible. The Gulf War had ended only a few years earlier, and tensions in the Middle East dominated the headlines. For hours, television pundits discussed potential links to Islamist groups. This premature assumption revealed a painful truth about media reflexes and public bias. The idea that terror could be homegrown hadn't yet entered the American imagination. That changed within 48 hours when investigators arrested Timothy McVeigh, a white American decorated veteran of the U.S. Army. The revelation stunned the country. The narrative flipped overnight. McVeigh was no foreign extremist. He was one of America's own. The media had to grapple with a new, uncomfortable storyline: terrorism from within, born not from foreign ideology, but from domestic disillusionment. As journalists dug deeper into McVeigh's life, they discovered a man obsessed with anti-government conspiracies, survivalist culture, and militia movements. His bookshelf contained works like the Turner Diaries, a racist, dystopian novel that had become a manifesto for extremists. He attended gun shows, ranted about Waco and Ruby Ridge, and saw himself as a soldier in a war against tyranny. The press quickly painted him as a symbol of homegrown hatred, but the question lingered: was he an isolated madman or part of a larger movement? This uncertainty fueled days of speculation, and in that vacuum, conspiracy theories flourished. Talk radio hosts and fringe commentators claimed there had been more bombs, government cover-ups, or secret accomplices. The FBI found itself fighting not only to solve the case, but to protect the truth from distortion. When Terry Nichols was arrested as McVeigh's co-conspirator, the story grew more complex. Nichols, too, was a military veteran. Together, they had constructed a truck bomb using common farm chemicals and stolen explosives. Their methodical planning, recorded in receipts, blueprints, and letters, revealed that this act of destruction had been months in the making. The media chronicled every detail, every witness, every court filing, every grain of evidence. America's living rooms became courtrooms of opinion. For the first time, the public saw domestic terrorism through a distinctly American lens. It wasn't a faceless enemy overseas. It was ideology weaponized by a neighbor. The trial of Timothy McVeigh became one of the most heavily covered legal proceedings in modern history. Cameras weren't allowed inside the courtroom, but daily reports, sketches, and commentaries brought every word of testimony to life. The prosecution, led by Joseph Hartzler, laid out the evidence in stark, chilling terms. McVeigh had parked a Ryder truck filled with 4 800-pounds of ammonium nitrate and fuel oil outside the Murrah building, lit the fuse, and walked away without hesitation. Witnesses described the horror of that morning: the thunderous blast, the shattered glass, the screams of children. Survivors took the stand, their voices trembling as they recalled the aftermath. The prosecution painted McVeigh as cold, methodical, and remorseless. The defense, led by Stephen Jones, attempted to portray him as a man disillusioned by government overreach, not inherently evil, but driven by misguided ideology. McVeigh himself remained eerily calm throughout the trial. He showed no visible remorse. When given the chance to speak, he quoted from Invictus, "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." The words chilled the courtroom. To many, they confirmed what they already believed. McVeigh saw himself not as a criminal, but as a martyr. The jury took less than 4 hours to find him guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to death. As the verdict was read, relatives of victims wept silently. Others bowed their heads in relief. Justice, at least in the legal sense, had been served, but it did not erase the pain. The execution of Timothy McVeigh on June 11, 2001, was the first federal execution in the United States in nearly 4 decades. Survivors and victims' families were allowed to watch via closed-circuit television. McVeigh declined to make a final statement, leaving behind a written copy of the same poem, Invictus. He remained defiant to the end. The media once again filled with debate. Was justice achieved, or merely vengeance? Commentators argued about capital punishment, government accountability, and the psychology of extremism. For many, McVeigh's death closed a chapter. For others, it raised new questions. Had America truly learned how to confront the hatred within its borders? While McVeigh's face faded from nightly news, his story lingered in documentaries, books, and classroom lessons. The Oklahoma City bombing became a case study for journalism schools and counterterrorism programs alike. How narratives form, how facts are framed, and how easily bias can cloud early reporting. Law enforcement, too, absorbed the lessons. The FBI developed stronger coordination with local agencies, better intelligence sharing, and protocols for managing major crime scenes. Media coverage was integrated into crisis management planning, recognizing its power to inform or inflame public opinion. The justice system, through the trials of McVeigh and Nichols, demonstrated its ability to operate under immense scrutiny while upholding the principles of fairness. The transparency of the proceedings reinforced public trust, even as emotions ran high. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the media and legal response was the public understanding of domestic terrorism itself. The story told through newspapers, television, and the courtroom shaped how Americans came to define the enemy, not as a foreign threat, but as an idea born of hatred, isolation, and radicalization. The Oklahoma City bombing was not just a legal case or a news cycle. It was a mirror held up to the nation's conscience, reflecting both its fragility and its resilience. The story America told itself through the media became part of its collective memory, a warning, a lesson, and a vow to remain vigilant. In the quiet aftermath of chaos, when the rescue sirens finally faded and the cameras left, the survivors of the Oklahoma City bombing were left to face a new kind of challenge, living beyond the blast. The explosion had lasted only seconds, but its effects would shape the rest of their lives. For them, the tragedy was not a historical event or a headline. It was a personal, daily battle with memory, loss, and the search for meaning. In the early days after April 19, 1995, grief hung heavy over Oklahoma City like a permanent storm cloud. Families wandered between hospitals and temporary morgues, clinging to hope, searching for names among the lists of the living. Some found closure in heartbreaking confirmations. Others were left with questions that would never be answered. For many survivors, the transition from shock to survival was blurred. The trauma of that morning replayed endlessly. Flashes of fire, screams collapsing ceilings, Some couldn't bear loud noises, others avoided downtown entirely. The smell of diesel or the sight of a yellow truck could send them spiraling back to that moment. Their minds had survived, but their peace had not. Yet amid the pain, something extraordinary began to emerge, a will to rebuild, not just buildings, but lives. Survivors found one another. They met in church basements, community centers, and makeshift support groups. They shared stories of fear and loss, realizing that their grief could be a bridge, not a wall. Out of those meetings grew a remarkable sense of purpose. They called themselves the Survivors Community. Their goal wasn't only to heal, but to ensure that those who had perished would never be forgotten. They became advocates, educators, and symbols of endurance. Through their voices, the tragedy of Oklahoma City transformed from an act of destruction into a movement for remembrance and change. One of the earliest efforts to channel grief into action was the creation of the Oklahoma City National Memorial and Museum. Designed to honor the 168 lives lost, the memorial became a sacred space, a blend of mourning and hope. At its center stood a shallow reflecting pool, running quietly between two massive bronze gates marked 9101 and 903, representing the moments before and after the explosion. Between those gates, the calm water reflected both the sky and the visitors who came to remember. On the lawn, 168 empty chairs were arranged in 9 rows, symbolizing the floors of the Murrah building. Each chair bore the name of a victim, with smaller chairs for the children lost that day. When night fell, the chairs glowed softly from within, transforming sorrow into light. The symbolism was clear. While the bombing had stolen lives, it could not extinguish their memory. Survivors like Bud Welch, who lost his 23-year-old daughter Julie in the blast, became voices of reconciliation rather than vengeance. In the midst of unimaginable grief, Bud found the courage to oppose Timothy McVeigh's execution. He spoke publicly about forgiveness, saying that hatred had already claimed too many lives. His message reached audiences around the world, reminding people that justice without compassion risks perpetuating the same cycle of violence. Other survivors took different paths. Some became advocates for victims' rights, pushing for better mental health resources and compensation for trauma survivors. Others worked with emergency response organizations, determined that future tragedies would meet quicker, more coordinated aid. For many, activism was a form of therapy, a way to reclaim control over lives that had been shattered by one man's rage. Children who survived the bombing grew up carrying both the weight and the wisdom of their experience. Some became social workers, teachers, or first responders themselves. They referred to themselves not as victims, but as living witnesses, proof that even in the darkest moments, humanity could endure. In 2000, 5 years after the attack, the survivors and families of victims participated in the dedication of the memorial. As the sun rose over the reflecting pool, a gentle silence fell across the crowd. Some held photographs of their loved ones, others stood hand in hand. For the first time since that April morning, many felt a sense of peace. The city that had once been torn apart by violence had rebuilt itself around remembrance. But remembrance was never meant to be passive. Survivors and community leaders turned their lessons into education. The Oklahoma City National Memorial and Museum became not just a tribute, but a center for learning. A place where students, law enforcement officers, and visitors from across the world could understand the consequences of hatred and the power of empathy. Interactive exhibits told the story not only of the bombing, but of the resilience that followed. The museum's Lessons of Hope program encouraged young people to discuss extremism, tolerance, and community responsibility. Survivors shared their stories in classrooms, urging students to recognize warning signs of radicalization and to choose compassion over anger. Their message was simple but profound: hate destroyed us once. We won't let it happen again. Over time, the survivors' voices reached far beyond Oklahoma. After 9/11, they traveled to New York City to meet with families of victims from the World Trade Center attacks. They shared experiences of grief, recovery, and unity, forming bonds between two cities linked by tragedy. The Oklahoma Standard became a blueprint for resilience. Ordinary citizens stepping up in extraordinary ways, helping one another with humility and heart. The spirit of remembrance extended even further. Saplings from the survivor tree, the American elm that withstood the blast, were planted across the United States and around the world. Each one represented rebirth from devastation. The tree's deep roots became a metaphor for the human spirit, scarred but unbroken. As years passed, annual remembrance ceremonies became a ritual of healing. On each April 19th, survivors, first responders, and families gathered at dawn. The names of all 168 victims were read aloud, one by one. The crowd stood in silence as church bells rang across the city. Some cried quietly, others smiled through tears. It was not just mourning. It was a reaffirmation of life, of the enduring bond between the living and the lost. The survivor's journey continues even now. New generations, born long after the bombing, visit the memorial and listen to those who lived through it. They learn not only about the attack itself, but about the strength that followed. Teachers use the event to discuss empathy, conflict resolution, and the dangers of ideological extremism. The survivors have become custodians of memory, carrying forward the lessons of their pain. They remind the world that tragedy does not define us. Our response to it does. In their courage, the story of the Oklahoma City bombing transforms from one of horror into one of hope. Every time a visitor stands before the reflecting pool and sees their own reflection mirrored back, they join that story. They become part of a collective promise to remember, to rebuild, and to reject hatred in all its forms. When the dust finally settled over downtown Oklahoma City in April 1995, it seemed impossible to imagine that the shattered heart of the city would ever beat again. The landscape was unrecognizable: twisted steel, burned vehicles, and a gaping crater where the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building had once stood. The bombing had left not only physical devastation, but also emotional and economic paralysis. Businesses closed, workers left the area, and the city's once bustling downtown became a ghostly reminder of tragedy. Yet out of that wreckage would rise something remarkable, a rebirth born from unity, determination, and hope. The process of rebuilding Oklahoma City wasn't quick or simple. It began with the most basic of questions. How could a community move forward when its very sense of safety had been torn apart? City leaders, citizens, and survivors gathered not just to rebuild structures, but to reclaim identity. The mission wasn't to erase what had happened, but to ensure that what emerged from the ashes would honor both the loss and the resilience of those who endured it. Mayor Ron Norick, who led the city at the time, described the challenge as rebuilding faith before rebuilding walls, trust between citizens, between government and community, had to be restored first. The bombing had shaken Oklahoma City's confidence in itself, but within days, something extraordinary began to happen. Volunteers flooded in from all corners of the nation. Churches, schools, and civic groups opened their doors. Ordinary citizens provided meals, shelter, and comfort to rescue workers and victims' families. This outpouring of compassion became known as the Oklahoma Standard, a phrase that would come to define the city's culture for decades. It symbolized three core values: service, honor, and kindness. These values became the moral foundation upon which the city's future would be rebuilt. Urban planners and architects faced a daunting task: reconstructing a downtown that had become synonymous with destruction. Some advocated for removing all traces of the bombing and starting fresh, while others insisted that the site must remain sacred, a place of memory as well as renewal. After months of public meetings and emotional debates, a consensus emerged. The area surrounding the bombing would be rebuilt, but the footprint of the Murrah building would be preserved as a memorial space. The design of the new downtown reflected that balance between remembrance and renewal. The memorial stood as a silent witness to the past, while around it, life gradually returned. New offices, restaurants, and apartments rose nearby. Streets once cordoned off by police tape filled with pedestrians and laughter again. The sound of construction replaced the echoes of sirens. City officials recognized that emotional healing required more than buildings. It demanded economic and cultural revival. The tragedy had left Oklahoma City with a national identity defined by sorrow. To change that, leaders launched a long-term revitalization effort that combined investment, innovation, and community engagement. The bombing became a catalyst for civic unity. Projects that had once been stalled by bureaucracy suddenly gained momentum. The MEMS Initiative, Metropolitan Area Projects, a visionary urban renewal program approved by voters in 1993, took on new urgency. It funded the construction of a new library, sports arena, riverfront improvements, and a performing arts center, symbols of a city determined to thrive, not just survive. Over time, Oklahoma City began to transform from an industrial hub into a modern, dynamic metropolis. New businesses and startups moved in, drawn by the city's reputation for resilience and community spirit. Residents who had once fled downtown returned, driven by pride and a sense of shared purpose. Civic leaders made a conscious decision to use the bombing as a source of strength rather than shame. They promoted Oklahoma City as an example of how adversity can fuel progress. Conferences, documentaries, and educational programs showcased the city's recovery as a model for other communities facing tragedy. The story of rebuilding became an export of hope. Culturally, the city experienced a rebirth as well. Artists, musicians, and writers drew inspiration from the tragedy, channeling pain into creation. Murals appeared on buildings near the memorial, depicting themes of unity, healing, and peace. Theater productions, music festivals, and storytelling events helped residents process grief and celebrate resilience. The Oklahoma City National Memorial Museum, completed in 2001, became a cornerstone of this cultural revival. It not only preserved history, but served as a platform for dialogue about hate, forgiveness, and the responsibility of memory. School groups from across the nation visited to learn not just about the bombing, but about the community's response. It became a place where tragedy was not just remembered, but transformed into education and empathy. One of the most symbolic gestures of renewal was the restoration of the downtown skyline. Where the Murrah building once stood in ruin, new structures rose, built with glass and light rather than concrete and steel. They reflected the sky, just as the reflecting pool at the memorial did, symbolizing transparency and openness. The message was clear. Oklahoma City would not hide its pain, but neither would it be defined by it. For the people who lived through the bombing, this new landscape was bittersweet. Every brick, every new business, stood as a testament to perseverance, but also as a reminder of what had been lost. Survivors who worked in the new buildings often paused to look out toward the memorial, finding comfort in knowing that those who died were never forgotten. The city's emotional reconstruction was perhaps its most profound achievement. The trauma had once divided people between grief and anger, between vengeance and forgiveness. But through years of open dialogue, shared mourning, and civic pride, unity replaced despair. Oklahomans discovered that healing did not mean forgetting. It meant building forward while carrying memory with dignity. By the 10th anniversary of the bombing, Oklahoma City had become a symbol of hope. National leaders and survivors gathered at the memorial, not just to mourn, but to celebrate how far the city had come. The memorial's survivor tree, once nearly dead, stood tall and full of life, its roots deep, its branches wide. Its leaves rustled in the wind like whispers of perseverance. The city's transformation also influenced national recovery efforts in future disasters. After 9/11, Hurricane Katrina, and other tragedies, officials from those regions visited Oklahoma City to learn from its approach to rebuilding community and spirit. The Oklahoma Standard became a guiding principle for how a city could face unthinkable loss and emerge stronger. Today, Oklahoma City stands as proof that tragedy can birth transformation. Its skyline gleams with renewal, its memorial glows with remembrance, and its people carry an unspoken understanding that the strength of a city is not measured by its buildings, but by the resilience of its heart. The story of Oklahoma City's rebirth is not only about what was rebuilt, but about what was redefined. The bombing had aimed to destroy faith in government, unity, and progress. But it accomplished the opposite. It strengthened them. Out of the rubble rose a community more compassionate, more connected, and more determined than ever to protect what hate had tried to erase. The Oklahoma City bombing wasn't just an attack on a building. It was an attack on the very foundation of American trust. On April 19, 1995, the United States witnessed something it hadn't imagined possible. A massive act of terrorism carried out not by foreign enemies, but by one of its own citizens. The shock of that realization rippled through every level of government, law enforcement, and society. In the years that followed, the bombing transformed how America thought about security, extremism, and the fragile balance between freedom and protection. Before Oklahoma City, the concept of domestic terrorism was largely overlooked in the American consciousness. Law enforcement focused primarily on foreign threats. The Cold War had just ended, and the idea that an American veteran would turn his anger against his own government seemed unthinkable. But Timothy McVeigh shattered that illusion. His truck bomb detonated outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building instantly redefined the national understanding of terrorism. The immediate impact was legislative. Within weeks, President Bill Clinton and Congress began pushing for stronger counterterrorism measures. The Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996 was a direct response to Oklahoma City. It tightened security around federal buildings, improved coordination among intelligence agencies, and imposed harsher penalties for terrorist activities. It also restructured how the FBI and Department of Justice handled domestic extremist groups, giving them broader authority to monitor and intervene before violence occurred. Yet these changes didn't come without controversy. Many civil rights advocates warned that new surveillance powers could infringe on privacy and freedom of speech. The debate that began after Oklahoma City, how far the government should go to ensure security, would echo through the decades, resurfacing after 9/11 and again in the digital age. One of the most significant outcomes of the bombing was the modernization of emergency response systems. In 1995, first responders in Oklahoma City faced chaotic communication, overlapping jurisdictions, and outdated equipment. The lessons learned from their struggle led to the establishment of the Incident Command System, ICS, and the National Incident Management System, NIMS, which standardized how agencies coordinate during disasters. These frameworks later became the backbone of the national response to crises such as the September 11 attacks and Hurricane Katrina. The bombing also redefined how law enforcement approached extremist threats. Prior to Oklahoma City, militia movements and anti-government groups operated largely under the radar. After the bombing, the FBI established Joint Terrorism Task Forces, JTTFs, to monitor such organizations and share intelligence across local, state, and federal levels. This interagency cooperation was unprecedented at the time and essential for preventing future attacks. Equally transformative was the shift in how government buildings were designed and protected. Security became a top priority. Federal facilities across the country were retrofitted with reinforced barriers, restricted vehicle access, and blast-resistant materials. Landscaping designs were changed to create natural buffer zones, and parking garages were relocated away from main structures. These architectural lessons would later inform the rebuilding of the Pentagon after 9/11 and other critical infrastructure nationwide. But beyond policies and security, the bombing reshaped America's psychological landscape. For the first time, the public faced the uncomfortable truth that homegrown extremism could be as deadly as foreign terrorism. The ideology that fueled McVeigh, a mix of anti-government anger, conspiracy theories, and militia rhetoric, forced the nation to confront its own divisions. It revealed how hate could ferment quietly within the heartland, disguised as patriotism, but driven by rage. This realization spurred new approaches to community engagement and early intervention. Federal and local authorities began programs aimed at identifying and de-radicalizing individuals drawn to extremist beliefs. Schools and community centers hosted educational campaigns about tolerance and critical thinking. The goal was not just to stop violence, but to understand its roots. The media landscape also evolved in response. Coverage of the bombing, both the immediate chaos and the subsequent investigation, became a turning point for how news organizations handled domestic terrorism. The 24-hour news cycle was in its infancy, and Oklahoma City proved how powerful, and at times dangerous, nonstop coverage could be. The nation watched, hour by hour, as rescuers searched for survivors, as McVeigh's face appeared on screens, and as conspiracy theories swirled. This intense exposure shaped public perception and raised difficult questions about journalism's role in amplifying extremist narratives. Culturally, the Oklahoma City bombing became a reference point for tragedy and resilience. Films, documentaries, and books dissected every aspect of the event, from McVeigh's psychology to the heroic stories of rescue workers. Each retelling carried a warning that extremism, if ignored, could erupt anywhere, even in the most peaceful corners of America. In education, the bombing became a case study for crisis management and ethics. Universities incorporated it into courses on criminal justice, public safety, psychology, and architecture. It was used to teach how systems fail and how they can be rebuilt. Students learned not only about the mechanics of terrorism, but also about compassion, leadership, and the human cost of hate. The event also had a profound influence on federal law enforcement culture. Before Oklahoma City, agencies often operated in silos, reluctant to share information. Afterward, there was a cultural shift toward cooperation. The FBI's relationship with local law enforcement strengthened, and protocols were established for rapid information exchange. These developments would later prove vital in tracking terrorist networks in the post-9/11 world. For many Americans, however, the bombing's impact was deeply personal. It reshaped how they viewed patriotism and dissent. The line between legitimate criticism of government and violent rebellion became clearer and more carefully guarded. The tragedy forced the nation to distinguish between freedom of expression and rhetoric that incites destruction. The Oklahoma City bombing also had global implications. It caught the attention of international law enforcement agencies, who began reassessing their own vulnerabilities to domestic terrorism. Lessons learned from Oklahoma City were shared with allies, influencing global counterterrorism policies. It became a case study in how ideology, isolation, and anger could combine to create catastrophic violence. The attack also highlighted the power of memorialization in national healing. The Oklahoma City National Memorial and Museum became more than a tribute to victims. It became a symbol of how remembrance can drive change. Its message of, "Come here to remember those who were killed, those who survived, and those changed forever," resonated across the world. The site drew visitors from over 100 countries, each coming to witness how grief had been transformed into education and unity. 20 years after the bombing, President Barack Obama stood at that memorial and said, "The good people of Oklahoma City showed the world that in the face of evil, we will rise." His words captured what the nation had learned, that terrorism, whether foreign or domestic, can destroy buildings, but not resolve, not compassion, not community. The legacy of the Oklahoma City bombing endures in every policy that protects federal buildings, in every coordinated emergency response, and in every lesson taught about the dangers of extremism. It serves as a constant reminder that security is not only about defense, it's about awareness, vigilance, and unity. The bombing changed the trajectory of American history. It forced the nation to confront uncomfortable truths about its own divisions and vulnerabilities. But it also revealed something far stronger: the capacity for collective resilience. From law enforcement reform to community rebuilding, from memorialization to education, the Oklahoma City bombing became both a tragedy and a turning point. More than a quarter century has passed since that cloud of smoke rose over downtown Oklahoma City, but the echo of April 19, 1995 still lingers in America's collective memory. The bombing was more than a national tragedy. It became a mirror, reflecting both the depths of human cruelty and the extraordinary power of compassion. Its legacy lives not just in memorials or policy reforms, but in the moral and emotional fabric of a nation that vowed never to forget. In the quiet stillness of the Oklahoma City National Memorial, every symbol tells a story. The two monumental bronze gates, etched with the times 901 and 9703, mark the moments before and after the explosion. Between them lies the reflecting pool, a long, shallow ribbon of water where visitors can see their own faces shimmering against the backdrop of history. It invites self-reflection, a reminder that hate begins in the heart, and so must healing. The 168 empty chairs, arranged in 9 solemn rows, represent each life lost. 19 of them are smaller, crafted for the children who never came home from the daycare that morning. Their gentle presence among the larger chairs is the most haunting and human of all reminders that violence spares no innocence. Surrounding the site, life continues. Cars hum along Northwest 5th Street, tourists take photos, and children laugh in nearby parks. Yet even amid this normalcy, the memorial radiates quiet strength. It doesn't whisper vengeance or despair. It speaks of resilience, remembrance, and renewal. This was always the intention behind its creation. From the earliest planning sessions, survivors and families insisted that the memorial should not merely mourn, but teach the bombing's story, how hatred destroyed and how love rebuilt became a moral lesson for future generations. Every school tour that passes through the museum, every student who reads the names on those chairs, inherits that responsibility to remember what intolerance can do and what empathy can undo. The survivors themselves became living messengers of that lesson. Many who were injured in the bombing or lost loved ones later dedicated their lives to advocacy, public service, and education. People like Bud Welch, whose daughter Julie died in the explosion, turned grief into grace. Initially filled with anger, Welch publicly opposed the death penalty for Timothy McVeigh, saying that vengeance could never bring healing. His journey from hatred to forgiveness became a powerful story of moral courage, shared in classrooms and peace forums around the world. Other survivors founded organizations to promote violence prevention and community resilience. They spoke at universities, trained first responders, and helped shape policies around trauma support. Their message was simple yet profound. No community is immune to tragedy, but every community has the power to heal from it. Over the decades, the lessons of Oklahoma City have been woven into national preparedness strategies and memorial cultures. After the September 11 attacks, planners and architects designing the 9/11 Memorial in New York visited Oklahoma City to learn how to create a sacred space that honors both loss and life. The concepts of open reflection, symbolic structure, and community involvement, all pioneered in Oklahoma, became global standards for memorialization. The Oklahoma City tragedy also remains a cornerstone in counterterrorism education. The FBI Academy in Quantico continues to use it as a case study in domestic extremism. Trainees analyze how a decorated Gulf War veteran became radicalized by anti-government rhetoric, how intelligence gaps allowed him to operate unnoticed, and how swift investigative collaboration led to his capture. The goal is not only to understand what went wrong, but to ensure it never happens again. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the bombing lies not in policy, architecture, or policing. It lies in the way Americans view one another. The tragedy exposed the deep consequences of division, reminding the country that violent ideologies thrive in isolation, anger, and misinformation. It also revealed the antidote connection. The people of Oklahoma City didn't wait for federal orders or media coverage. They acted out of instinctive humanity. They comforted, they rebuilt, they forgave. That spirit, known now as the Oklahoma Standard, continues to define the city's identity. The Oklahoma Standard's 3 principles, service, honor, and kindness, have become the blueprint for how communities can respond to crisis. Each April, the city commemorates the anniversary of the bombing not only with silence, but with action. Volunteers clean parks, deliver meals, donate blood, and support neighbors in need. It's a living tribute, one that turns remembrance into purpose. In schools across Oklahoma, Students study the bombing not as distant history, but as a call to empathy. Teachers lead discussions on tolerance, civic responsibility, and the dangers of hate speech. Survivors visit classrooms to share their stories firsthand, reminding young listeners that violence doesn't begin with bombs. It begins with words and beliefs left unchecked. In this way, the city transformed tragedy into education, ensuring that the memory of April 19 isn't buried under time, but carried forward as warning and wisdom. For many, the survivor tree remains the most powerful symbol of that endurance. Once a charred and broken American elm that stood near the blast site, it was expected to die. Yet it didn't. Against all odds, it bloomed again the following spring. Today, it stands tall at the memorial's heart, its branches spreading wide and strong. Seeds from the tree are planted across the United States and around the world, in schools, police academies, and memorial gardens, each one a living descendant of resilience. Wherever they grow, they remind people that even in the aftermath of destruction, life can flourish. Internationally, Oklahoma City's example has influenced responses to tragedies from Norway's 2011 attacks to the Boston Marathon bombing. Cities facing terrorism or hate-fueled violence often cite Oklahoma City as proof that recovery isn't just about rebuilding structures, it's about rebuilding trust. The city's post-bombing transformation, its blending of sorrow and strength, has become a universal model for healing. Timothy McVeigh's execution in 2001 closed one chapter of the story, but it didn't end it. His death did not erase the pain or the questions his actions raised. Instead, it reinforced the nation's understanding that justice is not revenge. It is accountability. The survivors who chose forgiveness proved that moral strength can outlast any act of violence. Today, as America continues to grapple with division, extremism, and the threat of domestic terrorism, the lessons of Oklahoma City remain painfully relevant. The same undercurrents of mistrust and anger that motivated McVeigh still exist in parts of society. The challenge for every generation is to recognize those warning signs early, to engage in dialogue before hatred hardens into violence. The Oklahoma City bombing changed how America protects itself, how it mourns, and how it heals. It stands as both a cautionary tale and a beacon of hope, a reminder that darkness can emerge from within, but so can light. Each year, when the names are read aloud at the memorial, the air fills with the sound of wind moving through the survivor tree's leaves. It's as if the city itself is whispering its promise. We remember, we rebuild, we rise. In the end, the legacy of Oklahoma City is not about what was destroyed, but about what endured. It is about courage born from chaos, unity forged from heartbreak, and a future built upon remembrance. The story of that April morning continues to guide the conscience of a nation, teaching that even amid unspeakable loss, humanity's greatest strength is its capacity to heal, to forgive, and to hope again.